To my astonishment, not only did I catch the wave of time travel, but I also found myself immersed in the world of Harry Potter. What is that delightful aroma? It appears to be the enticing scent of cream-filled biscuits. Chapter 81. Encounters and Escapes. The day after returning from Egypt, George and Fred set out to visit Blair, bearing gifts. As the two departed the following day, Mrs. Weasley lamented the remarkable bond shared among the trio. The Weasley children, aware of the truth, regarded their mother with expressions that conveyed a sense of complexity. George and Fred did not forewarn Blair, leaving him in ignorance of their plans. All Blair knew was that the two had just returned yesterday. It was Mrs. Vance who answered the door upon hearing the doorbell ring. "Oh, you too," Mrs. Vance began, but paused abruptly. This was due to the two individuals before her gesturing for silence with their hands. Mrs. Vance made an okay gesture, allowing them to enter. After presenting the gifts to Mrs. Vance and her husband, George and Fred ascended the stairs to find Blair. A series of knocks echoed. Blair heard the sound of knocking and, while approaching the door, remarked, "Mother, I will be stepping out for some fresh air." I swear, just as he was about to make yet another summer vacation vow, he opened the door to find George and Fred. Before Blair's mind could fully process the situation, his arms instinctively wrapped around the waists of the two standing before him. "Let's go and fulfill that vow you just mentioned. Let's step outside for some activity, Blair." As George and Fred spoke, they pulled Blair out the door, prompting Mrs. Vance to remark, "At least I won't need to call for him." Walking side by side along the path, Blair sensed the strong, watchful presence emanating from both of them. "Do you notice anything different?" Blair asked, quickening his pace to create distance as he spun around before them. During the holiday, Blair had cut his hair short, a decision he himself deemed rather unappealing at the time. Consequently, whenever he shared a double mirror with the two, Blair would strategically position himself to conceal his face. Thus, this was the first occasion George and Fred beheld Blair with his newly shortened hair. "Your hair is shorter," Fred remarked as he drew closer, and upon finishing his sentence, his hand playfully ruffled Blair's hair. After being tousled, his short hair bore an uncanny resemblance to a bird's nest. Blair, striving to smooth his locks, inquired, "Is it unattractive?" "Not at all," was the response exchanged twice. Over the passage of time, Blair's hair had become far less unsightly than it appeared immediately after the haircut. "You become even paler, Lyle. You must have hardly ventured out since the holiday commenced." George, observing Blair, articulated the changes he perceived. "It's the front door," Blair corrected George's terminology as he walked. "No wonder Aunt Ambrose insists on encouraging you to venture outdoors," George remarked with a sudden realization. "Essentially, I have not succeeded even once." Blair reflected on the scant outings he had embarked upon since the holiday began. The three of them strolled and conversed, eventually arriving at a park where Blair urged both companions to sit on a bench and bask in the sun. With his eyes closed, soaking up the sun, Blair began to feel drowsy. The sound of George and Fred's conversation became increasingly soothing to his ears. Previously, during their daily conversations through the two-way mirror, Blair had spent more than half of the holiday drifting off to sleep while listening to their voices, nearly developing a conditioned response. After a yawn, Blair felt as if something had been tossed into his mouth. After a brief lick, he opened his eyes. Patchy's chocolate. When George and Fred had inquired about what gift Blair desired, he recalled mentioning this very treat. "Correct. Now savor this flavor." George, breaking off a piece of chocolate, fed it to Blair's mouth. "This flavor is delightful as well," Blair remarked as he savored the chocolate. Blair received his gift, while George and Fred also obtained their desired present, a multitude of flavors in the form of kisses. In the latter part of the holiday, the trio spent time together, relishing their camaraderie as in times past. As the school term approached, Mr. Weasley sent them a letter. "Peter Pettigrew has escaped." Mr. Weasley dropped a bombshell on the three at the very outset of the letter. Before heading to Diagon Alley, George and Fred briefed the Vance couple about these developments, proposing that Blair accompany them home. Upon hearing the account, the Vance couple readily consented. "Blair Vance, you never mentioned this matter to us," unmasking a murderer. Mr. Vance gazed at Blair, who bowed his head and confessed, "I was wrong, Mom and Dad." Though Mrs. Vance remained silent, Blair felt her disapproving gaze. He understood that acknowledging his mistake was of utmost importance. Mr. Vance, after imparting a few words of advice, ultimately forgave him. After all, according to George and Fred, This incident had transpired a considerable time ago. Mrs. Vance, following Blair's admission, inquired about the contents of his luggage. Bring a few more of these clothes and this. As Mrs. Vance filled the suitcase with items, Blair felt as if he were not preparing for school, but rather fleeing. In the following days, Blair resided in the humble abode, and on one particular day, several owls arrived. It was time to embark on their shopping trip to Diagon Alley. Upon arriving with the Weasley family, Blair noticed wanted posters affixed to every wall. The children curiously examined the posters, with Mr. and Mrs. Weasley observing them. How are these different from the others? Blair wondered aloud, gazing at the two distinct sets of wanted posters. George leaned in to read aloud. One is issued by the Ministry of Magic, and the other is for Sirius. Sirius Black. Fred and Blair also leaned in for a closer look. Merlin, the bounty on Sirius is higher than that offered by the Ministry. After Fred finished reading, the children's curiosity waned, and the Weasley couple prepared to take them to procure books. On their way to Flourish and Blots, they encountered Sirius and Harry. You've posted more than the Ministry, mate, Mr. Weasley remarked to Sirius. There will be even more in a few days, Sirius replied, indicating that he would increase the bounty if no news emerged. Do you think posting them in Muggle territory would yield better results? Sirius inquired of the Weasley couple. It's worth a try, was the affirmative response that spurred Sirius to make preparations upon his return. It seems that soon, father and mother will discover what the murderer truly looks like. As Blair listened to Sirius's words, he pondered inwardly. Chapter 82, Game Extra. Are you too certain that what you just articulated are the rules of the game? Blair found himself doubting the reality of his own hearing. Yet, the nodding heads of the two individuals before him confirmed that he was not, in fact, hallucinating. It truly was merely a game. As Lyle George gently remarked while shaking Blair's hand, "Do you not trust us?" Fred gazed intently into Blair's eyes as he spoke. Ultimately, Blair acquiesced. George and Fred once again savored a kiss imbued with a different flavor. This time, they approached the task with purpose. What flavor is it? Blair inquired, looking at the two blindfolded individuals. Caramel. X2. Blair placed the caramel-flavored chocolate back on the table, stating, "You guessed incorrectly." Before George and Fred could voice their objections, Blair switched to another flavor and kissed them again. What flavor is this? Strawberry. X2. The blindfolded duo detected the rapid change in Blair's breathing. Wrong again. Although unable to see, George could vividly imagine the expression on Blair's face. As Lyle would say, it should be termed as a small person gaining the upper hand. George pondered, his lips betraying his thoughts. You are the one being a small person gaining the upper hand. Is that how this phrase is meant to be used? Blair countered, hearing the Chinese words tumble from George's mouth. Ha ha ha. I believe the term should be one of exasperation, Fred chimed in, echoing Blair's sentiment. To prevent the two from unleashing more irritating remarks, Blair resolved to swiftly continue the game. Lyle. George barely opened his mouth before being silenced. Speak less, Blair admonished, lightly tapping George's face. After kissing Fred, Blair remarked, You too, Fred. Now, tell me, what flavor is this? Blair added promptly. Just a reminder. If you guess incorrectly again, that would be 3 strikes. Pistachio. X2. This time, Blair did not bother with theatrics, holding the pistachio-flavored chocolate, but proclaiming, Congratulations. You have answered incorrectly once more. After a moment of silence, George stated, I feel Lyle is toying with us. What do you think, Fred? A sense of foreboding crept over Blair, who, discarding the chocolate, attempted to flee. As he turned, he was promptly seized. I think the same, Fred confirmed, holding onto the fleeing Blair. With the grip holding him back, Blair's mind raced with a singular thought. This has spiraled out of control upon turning back. Blair beheld George removing the blindfold from his eyes. Hiss, this is enticement. This is undeniably enticement. While Blair's focus waned, Fred swiftly bound his hands with the scarf. Unable to resist the allure, Blair attempted to reach out. Hand, when did you tie me up? Blair exclaimed. Fred answered Blair's inquiry. You were tempted at that moment. George approached Blair with another scarf in hand. Understanding the implication, Blair willingly settled onto the bed, extending his legs. I am doing this voluntarily, not under duress, Blair asserted to maintain his dignity. The only responses were the amused chuckles of George and Fred. Hold on. How do we proceed from here? Just as Blair finished speaking, he noticed George retrieving yet another scarf from who knows where. How many of these did you buy? No sooner had he asked than Blair found his vision obscured once more. Suddenly deprived of sight, Blair instinctively reached out to grasp something. However, he restrained himself. Lyle, since we are guessing, it is now your turn to guess. George and Fred elucidated the rules of the game. Guess? What am I guessing? Blair's voice quivered with anticipation. No sooner had he spoken than he felt a pair of hands cover his face. No one answered Blair's question, and the room fell into an unusual silence. Although his query went unanswered, Blair sensed he understood the situation. George, Blair ventured. Incorrect answer. X2. Two voices of denial rang out simultaneously. I refuse to believe it, Blair declared, turning to bite the hand that covered his face. Unbind me, at the very least. Let me see the answer. Blair directed his gaze forward. Soon, the scarf that had obscured his eyes was untied. George raised his hand, bearing the teeth marks. A triumphant sound escaped Blair. I told you I did not guess incorrectly. Fred's voice drifted from the side. Indeed, guessing George was quite astute. Now it's my turn. If I am wrong, let us just say I said nothing, Blair interjected swiftly. George's laughter resonated within the room. Blair's guesses remained remarkably accurate, preventing the game from descending into tragedy. He had not erred once. For a moment, the room was enveloped in silence, save for the sound of Blair calling out names. By the time he reached the end, Blair felt dizzy, not from an inability to guess, but rather because, after each answer, no one revealed the correct one, while the questions rapidly shifted. From initially placing hands on his face, it progressed to various other positions. Ultimately, Blair collapsed onto the bed, feeling his mind overloaded. All right, I declare the game time concluded. As Blair spoke, he reached up to untie the scarf from around his eyes. Upon lifting his head, he was greeted by the perplexed expressions of George and Fred. In their bewildered gaze, Blair waved the scarf in his hand. This scarf is barely effective for blindfolding. Binding hands. You two cannot genuinely believe you can restrain me. With that, Blair flicked one end of the scarf towards the two standing before him. And as for my legs, you two won't have a next time. With a casual flick of the scarf around his ankles, it fell to the floor. Blair laughed, spreading his arms wide as he bounded towards them. It dawned upon George and Fred that Blair's declaration of voluntary participation was not merely a matter of pride. He genuinely wished to play along with them. There will undoubtedly be a next time. George caught the scarf that Blair tossed at him. Fred wrapped a section of the scarf around his hand, looking at Blair as he spoke. Next time, let us ensure it's more secure. Blair stood and covered Fred's mouth. No need for security. There will be no next time. Whether it's secure or not is irrelevant. I shall cooperate regardless, Blair asserted. George and Fred found merit in Blair's reasoning. After all, Lyle willingly chose to engage with them, and that was what truly mattered. Chapter 83, Dementor. Fred and George noticed that Blair appeared particularly tense today. This was evidenced by his firm grip on his wand as they entered the compartment, as if prepared to duel whatever might come their way. Moreover, unlike their usual seating arrangement, where the three always sat together on one side, this time Blair chose to sit opposite them. Lyle, why are you so anxious? George inquired. Do you recall what I mentioned to you during the summer? Blair retorted. Are you suggesting that there will be Dementors? As soon as George finished speaking, Fred chimed in. Then let us test whether our Patronus charm can indeed be effective. After Fred spoke, he and George both drew their wands. In the final days of summer vacation, Blair had mentioned to them that they might encounter Dementors upon their return to school. George and Fred inquired how he knew this, to which Blair replied. It's a kind of intuition. Together, they familiarized themselves with the Patronus charm. However, due to the prohibition against minors using magic outside school, none of them had practiced it before. As the three of them gripped their wands, the Hogwarts Express came to a sudden halt. The temperature within the carriage plummeted, and a pair of ashen hands appeared on the frosted window. The three held their breath, their wands nearly crumpled under the pressure of their grip. At that moment, the lights in the carriage flickered out, amplifying their fear in the enveloping darkness. Just when Blair was at the height of his anxiety, he felt a hand clasp his own. It was Fred. Blair nearly snapped the wand in his other hand in surprise. George's arm draped over Blair's shoulder. When did they? The opening of the carriage door interrupted Blair's thoughts. A hand, resembling that of a decaying corpse, emerged before their eyes. The incantations Blair had rehearsed in his mind suddenly became a jumbled mess. He instinctively grasped Fred's hand. Think of something happy, Blair. It's time to practice. George and Fred's voices echoed simultaneously. Their words, though soft, resonated with piercing clarity in the hushed carriage. Expecto Patronum. They chanted in unison. The tips of their wands emitted a silvery glow. Although not fully formed, their simultaneous spellcasting was just enough to fend off the Dementor. Outside the carriage, a Patronus appeared, driving the Dementor away. Once it vanished, the temperature within the carriage gradually rose, and the lights flickered back to life. Under the illumination, George and Fred noticed that Blair's complexion had turned rather pale. Recalling the sweets and chocolates they had brought with them, George and Fred prepared to retrieve some. Just as they moved, Blair stopped them. His wand had fallen to the floor, and George picked it up, tousling his hair before sitting beside Blair. Fred settled on the other side, enveloping Blair in warmth. George waved Blair's wand before him, saying, I wager it nearly met its end in your grasp today. I confess I was frightened, Blair admitted. Were you two not afraid as well? Who said that? Not I. It is George who is afraid, Fred countered. Watching the two bicker light-heartedly lifted Blair's spirits considerably. If your voices had not trembled earlier, I might have believed you, he remarked as he reclaimed his wand. You too. Blair began to say that they were also quite scared, but as he opened his mouth, a piece of candy was shoved inside. I just remembered. I have candy in my pocket, George's voice chimed in. As the sweetness was savored, George's voice once again reached Blair's ears. But there's only one, Blair. Blair turned to look at George, who then received a kiss flavored with strawberry. Fred followed suit, earning a kiss with the taste of dark chocolate. The bittersweet essence lingered on their tongues. Upon disembarking, the trio heard Ron recounting Harry's recent exploits on the train. Harry summoned a Patronus, which took the form of a stag. Wow, Harry, you truly are a genius in this regard. The three of us could only muster a puff of white mist. George and Fred approached Harry, who nodded in affirmation of their words. Harry smiled and explained that he had practiced with Sirius's wand over the summer. During the feast, Professor Dumbledore announced changes among the faculty, revealing that this year's defense against the dark arts class would be taught by Remus Lupin. Harry introduced Lupin to Hermione and Ron, mentioning that he was a close friend of Sirius. Subsequently, Dumbledore announced that Hogwarts would be hosting a special group of guests. Given their recent encounter, everyone understood that the guests were the Dementors. After the feast, it was time to ascend the stairs. After a strenuous climb, the fat lady refused to open the door. As she showcased her vocal talents, the group covered their ears. Oh, the fat lady's singing. She cannot carry a tune to save her life. Everyone exclaimed as they entered the common room. I have a feeling I will be haunted by her high notes in my dreams tonight, Blair remarked as he prepared for bed. Will the cup shatter? I don't know, but my eardrums. Lee, recalling the fat lady's performance, began to speak, but was interrupted by George and Fred's suggestion. We could sing for you, Blair. It will undoubtedly be more melodious than the fat lady's high notes. Lee quickly retorted, no, must we torment our ears tonight? You need not listen, Lee, Fred replied, and soon the duo's singing echoed through the dormitory. Light and melodious. Blair closed his eyes, feeling remarkably drowsy. After they finished, Lee remarked, you two really should have me plug my ears. With that, he buried himself under the blankets. George and Fred sang a lullaby well known in the magical world, perfectly suited to the moment, though they humorously substituted Baby with Lover. As they sang, Blair joined in with a few casual hums, but soon fell silent. George and Fred approached his bedside, eager to inquire if he enjoyed their performance, only to discover that Blair had already drifted off into slumber. This merely confirms that we sang rather well, one said. You make a valid point, brother. They nodded in agreement, gently clapping their hands before returning to their respective beds. Chapter 84, Care of Magical Creatures. This year, the changes among the professors extended beyond just defense against the dark arts. The Care of Magical Creatures class also had a new instructor. Hagrid had been appointed as the professor for this course. George and Fred were particularly intrigued by the books that Hagrid would require for his lessons. When Blair returned to the dormitory after washing up, he was met with an outrageous sight. George and Fred had pried open the Monster Book of Monsters. While he was stuffing something into its mouth. What are you doing? Are you abusing it? How can one abuse a book? Blair approached with curiosity, only to find that the monster book was gnawing on the object Lee had forced into its mouth. We were merely curious, George and Fred explained, glancing at Blair with wide eyes. We never anticipated it would be aggressive. As they spoke, the two instinctively opened their hands. And immediately the dormitory was filled with Lee's piercing scream. Open its mouth. Merlin, help me. Realizing what they had just been doing, George and Fred hurriedly attempted to pry open the mouth of the monstrous book. Heal as before. Once Lee's hand was freed, Blair quickly cast a spell to remove the curse from his hand. Tell me, what were you two thinking just now? Lee inquired, gazing at George and Fred. The two, caught in their moment of inquiry, either stared at the ceiling or the floor. The monstrous book was pinned to the table by Fred, and Blair was equally intrigued by it. He reached out to touch the book's mouth, but the monstrous book's jaws snapping shut halted his movement. Fred noticed this and increased his grip, causing the mouth to close. He then looked at Blair, his expression urging him to try. Blair stepped forward, running his hand along the spine of the book, which automatically opened wide. This thing is actually a book, George remarked, observing the now opened monstrous book. Before it opened, I almost thought it was a prank product, Fred added. Lee nodded in agreement with Fred's sentiment. Doesn't that just provide you with inspiration? Upon hearing Blair's words, George and Fred's eyes sparkled. Genius, Blair, they exclaimed in unison. Lee rolled his eyes at their reaction but clapped his hands nonetheless. Once you've created it, remember to show it to me, Lee said while applauding. The next day during Hagrid's class, numerous students were pressing against the monstrous book. Some were so startled by its opening and closing mouth that they fell to the ground. Hagrid's voice rang out. Does anyone know how to open this book? He held it, appearing somewhat anxious. George and Fred harmoniously responded to Hagrid's question. Very well, yes, just like they said, you simply need to touch the spine, Hagrid said, his nervousness easing as he thanked George and Fred with his grateful gaze. Subsequently, Hagrid introduced an unexpected creature. Wow, Hagrid, that's so cool, exclaimed a voice near Blair's ear. Hagrid, what is this? Fred asked, voicing his curiosity. Blair felt a surge of excitement and took a step forward, but recalling the potential consequences of being too forward, he grasped Fred's hand. Sensing Blair's action, Fred obediently stepped back, waiting for Hagrid's response. This is a hippogriff, Fred. After addressing Fred's question, Hagrid went on to describe the hippogriff's temperament. All right, who wants to come say hello? Hagrid said, turning to approach the hippogriff. Fred looked down at Blair, the inquiry in his gaze unmistakable. Blair nodded and then switched hands, pulling George along as they stepped back with the crowd. Good, Fred. Come on, Hagrid encouraged. Following Hagrid's guidance, Fred successfully approached the hippogriff. Now you can ride it, Hagrid said, and with that, Fred mounted it. Almost immediately, Fred was lifted into the air. Wow. As Fred soared away, a wave of excitement erupted from the crowd. Are you going to try it, Blair? George asked, giving Blair's hand a gentle squeeze. Blair replied, nodding towards the direction Fred had flown. Hagrid, can the hippogriff carry 2 people? George leaned closer to Hagrid and inquired. I'm afraid not, George. Upon receiving the response, George returned to Blair's side, making a pouting face at him and saying, plan failed. Blair chuckled at George's expression, patting his hand. This plan never really had a chance of success. While waiting for Fred's return, everyone, along with Hagrid, found places to sit. As the hippogriff returned, those seated eagerly stood up. The remainder of the lesson went smoothly, but due to time constraints, only a few students got to ride the hippogriff. By the end of the class, Hagrid appeared completely at ease, contrasting with his earlier nervous demeanor. During Quidditch practice, Fred felt as though the speed of the flying broomsticks had slowed down. Since Blair hadn't ridden the hippogriff, after a brief rest following practice, Fred expressed his desire to take Blair flying. Fred adeptly maneuvered the broomstick, with Blair in front, arms outstretched against the wind. George flew alongside, providing protection. Blair felt this treatment was simply marvelous. He shouted his sentiments into the wind. The gust carried Blair's words to Fred, who then flew even faster. Incorporating some dives and climbs, Blair felt as though he were on a thrilling roller coaster. By the time they grew weary, it was nearly dinner time. The 3, their appetites ravenous, heartily indulged in the feast laid out on the long table. While eating, Blair spotted Professor Lupin at the staff table. Recalling the upcoming defense against the dark arts class, due to the previous unreliable instructor, the curriculum for several years at Hogwarts had become nearly uniform. Boggett, Blair mused, contemplating what form his Boggett might take, and popped another bite into his mouth. Chapter 85, Boggett. As the black cabinet began to shake, the breath of the classroom hushed in anticipation. Professor Lupin briefly introduced the creature within the cabinet. There is a very simple spell that can deal with it. Repeat after me. Ridiculous. The students in the classroom chanted in unison, ridiculous. When it came time to select a volunteer for demonstration, Blair found himself chosen by Lupin. Before Blair stepped forward, George and Fred gave him encouraging pats on the shoulder. You got this, Blair. Don't be afraid. It's all just a trick. The words of encouragement echoed in his ears as Blair approached Lupin. Tell me, what are you most afraid of? Lupin asked, looking at Blair. I'm not quite sure, Professor. Blair replied, shaking his head. Ah, then what you are facing now is the fear of the unknown. Good luck, Blair. After saying this, Lupin instructed Blair to ready his wand. Holding his wand towards the cabinet, Blair followed Lupin's count as he chanted, 1, 2, 3, as the cabinet door swung open. The most agitated emotions were not felt by Blair, but rather by George and Fred standing in the crowd. Others may not have recognized it, but George knew that the figure appearing to suffer with hands clasped over its ears was him. Fred gazed at his own silent form, sprawled on the ground, his brow furrowing in concern. Both George and Fred noticed that, aside from the 2 of them, 2 other individuals lay nearby, Mr. and Mrs. Vance. The moment they caught sight of the Boggett, they rushed forward without hesitation. By the time they reached Blair's side, he had already completed the incantation. The terrifying scene transformed into a multitude of balloons that burst in the air. Blair, pulling George and Fred along, made his way back. As they passed Professor Lupin, Blair remarked, Professor Lupin, you may proceed. The attention of the others shifted once more to the ominous black cabinet. The trio moved to the rear of the crowd. Lyle, you appear, remarkably composed, Fred observed, casting a glance at Blair. That is not composure. It is despair, Fred, Blair reflected, recalling the fleeting moment that felt like plunging into an icy abyss, leaving him numb. After uttering those words, he felt himself enveloped in the embrace of George and Fred. It's all an illusion, Lyle. It's all a ruse. Do not worry. I assure you, I will safeguard my ears. I also promised to remain vigilant, Lyle. George and Fred repeatedly assured him of their commitment to safety, emphasizing that everything earlier had been fabricated. Blair wrapped his arms around their waists and declared, "Neither of you would ever behave that way, nor would Mom and Dad. Indeed, and the boggart merely reflects your fears. It does not foretell the future," Fred said, affectionately ruffling Blair's hair. "This only proves how significant we are to you," George chimed in with a smile. Blair nodded, despite his hair being tousled. Throughout the class, the trio had remained at the back, and by the end, neither George nor Fred had been called upon to confront the boggart directly. The phrases Blair heard most during the lesson were "I promise," and "it's all fake." As they exited the classroom, George and Fred continued to reiterate, "Every part of you is insured." "Stop it. I'm starting to feel faint," Blair said, covering their mouths. Okay, came the muffled responses from the two. During the ensuing moments, Blair's hand remained firmly clasped, never released. Although Blair insisted he was unafraid and aware that everything was a fabrication, George and Fred sensed that he was still apprehensive. After all, if he were truly fearless, the boggart would not have manifested in such a manner. The onlookers accepted the trio's classroom demeanor and their current hand-holding stroll through the castle quite well. Some had already suspected, while others perceived it as a testament to their brotherly bond. Lee was thoroughly pleased with their liberated display. Just as he savored the moment, a Gryffindor student approached him for an interview, inquiring about the experience of sharing a room with a couple. "Is that your way of asking if I have a peculiar preference?" Lee retorted loudly. Later that evening, upon returning to their dormitory, Blair and the others found Lee lying silently on his bed. After exchanging glances, they prepared to perform. George and Fred conjured some white flowers to hold. Blair hummed a mournful tune, gesturing as if in prayer. "Lee, ah!" George and Fred called out, placing the flowers beside Lee's pillow. "What?" Lee exclaimed, realizing what the three were up to as he sprang from his bed. The petals of the flowers spread and floated into the air, accompanied by Blair's mournful melody, creating a scene that appeared all too fitting. "I'm not dead yet. Be quiet, Blair. And you too, stop it," Lee shouted at the floating white petals. Blair shut his mouth, making the flowers vanish. "So what's wrong, brother?" "Your earlier demeanor was perfect for the scene we created," George and Fred remarked. Lee recounted the day's tribulations to the trio. "I want to change dorms. Otherwise, they might actually think I have a peculiar preference." After Lee's statement, the dormitory fell into complete silence. Observing the thoughtful expressions on George and Fred's faces, Lee realized that the two were genuinely contemplating the feasibility of that idea. Shifting his gaze to Blair, he mused, "The ceiling is quite lovely. The dormitory decor is rather nice." Blair thought to himself, admiring the room he had inhabited for nearly 5 years. "Tomorrow, I'll ask Professor McGonagall." Lee exclaimed loudly, observing the trio's expressions. We could give it a try." "We three will accompany you tomorrow," George and Fred chimed in unison. "What on earth are the three of you going for?" Lee asked in response. "To prove that your claims are factual, not fabricated," Blair replied, looking at Lee. George and Fred nodded in agreement. Lee seemed to lose all his energy, collapsing back onto his bed. Then, Fred, glancing at Blair, remarked, "Not done yet." But before he could finish, Lee jumped up, ready to challenge him. The first ever dormitory boxing championship officially commenced. The outcome was swift. Lee was out. The next day, the four of them approached Professor McGonagall to request a dormitory change. "I'm afraid that won't be possible." Professor McGonagall's words shattered Lee's dreams. Chapter 86, The Amortentia. Blair stirred the potion in the cauldron clockwise. Under the watchful eyes of Blair and Fred, the potion gradually lightened in color. This concoction was the most effective amortentia, the elixir of infatuation. Their success was not singular. Evidently, the curiosity surrounding love had triumphed over any trepidation regarding the professor. The potion's classroom buzzed with excitement. "Do you smell that? Whose scent is it?" Such queries were the ones Blair faintly heard most frequently. "Lyle, do you catch a whiff of something?" Fred eagerly awaited Blair's response, curious about what fragrance could represent him and George. Blair leaned closer to the cauldron and inhaled. "The scent of gunpowder," he mused, recalling the embraces he received from Fred and George after their fireworks experiments, which always bore a hint of that aroma. The cloyingly sweet scent reminded him of the candies and cakes George and Fred made, or the chocolates they had brought previously. The grassy fragrance transported Blair to the Quidditch pitch, watching George and Fred train. The scents he had detected in the burrow and the lingering aroma on Fred and George's clothes. All these fragrances were inextricably linked to Fred and George. As Blair articulated the scents he recognized, Fred clearly associated those aromas with cherished memories. A radiant smile blossomed on Fred's face. "It's your turn, Fred. Take a whiff and see what scents you can discern," Blair encouraged, observing the joyful expression on Fred's face. It seemed that as Fred leaned closer to the cauldron to sniff, his happiness only intensified. The once cold and dim potions classroom, in Blair's eyes, transformed. becoming a place of warmth and brightness. The scents that Fred spoke of were all intricately tied to Blair, the aroma of the ink used for tattoos, the fragrance of the meals prepared by Blair, and the smell of the ink from the comic books they perused together. This time, it was George, who was teamed up with Lee, who glanced at the two laughing softly in the diagonal direction ahead, nearly grinding his back teeth to dust. Merlin. Why? George bit down hard, gazing out the window, silently shouting in his heart. Hey, take it easy, mate. Otherwise, you'll find yourself visiting the nurse's office before class is even over, Lee remarked quietly. George's eyes were fixed on Blair's retreating figure, as he awaited the moment when the person ahead would turn around. It was not just Blair who felt the weight of George's gaze, Fred did too. The two in front turned in unison to look at George, and the synchronized movement deepened George's complicated emotions. Blair, before even turning around, had already surmised that it must be George. As Blair turned to face him, George exaggeratedly contorted his expression into one of utmost grievance. Blair found it difficult to withstand George's expression. Had they been closer, he would have surely ruffled George's hair. The moment class concluded, George dashed to Blair's side, braving the murderous glare of Professor Snape. Blair took George and Fred by the hand, leading them out of the classroom. Once outside, Blair cupped George's face, playfully rubbing it before affectionately tousling his hair. What scent did you catch during class, George? Upon sensing Blair's clear attitude, George pushed past Fred, who stood beside Blair, wrapping his arm around Blair as he walked and recounted the various scents he had detected earlier. Fred, having been squeezed out, watched George embrace Blair, experiencing the same feelings he had felt earlier in class. Fred hurried to Blair's other side, eager to wrap his arm around him too. However, just as he was about to succeed, George shifted position, blocking him once more. After a few back-and-forth exchanges, Blair couldn't help but let out an amused laugh. Fred, unable to contain himself any longer, exclaimed, George. What? George replied, feigning ignorance as he looked at Fred. Blair found George's expression quite entertaining, while Fred could only perceive it as provocation. The two engaged in playful banter in the corridor, with Blair watching as a spectator. The way they sparred was something Blair deemed unworthy of his gaze. As the corridor grew increasingly crowded after class, Blair obscured his face with his hands. That's enough. Gentleman Weasley, he declared, pulling George and Fred apart. Still hidden from Blair's view, George and Fred exchanged glances loaded with unspoken challenges. That evening, the three returned to Lee's tranquil dormitory. George and Fred resumed their research in the room of requirement. After familiarizing themselves with the love potion, they began to form some ideas. While initially assisting, Blair eventually grew so weary that he could barely keep his eyes open. He ultimately succumbed to slumber, propped up on his arms. When he hazily awoke, he found George and Fred still engrossed in their experiments. Are you two really not going to take a break? I've already had a nap, Blair questioned, prompting George and Fred to realize how long they had been at it. Shall we continue tomorrow? Fred inquired, glancing at George with a questioning look. George nodded in response, swiftly lifting Blair, who had been resting against Fred's waist. Fred felt a sudden lightness on his back, only to see Blair being hoisted away by George. Hold me, Blair, George whispered softly in Blair's ear. A bit dazed, Blair obediently wrapped his arms around George. As George evaded Fred's attempts to intercept them, Blair, with his eyes closed, found himself growing sleepier from the swaying motions. Eventually, he succumbed to slumber once more, his arms that had been draped around George's neck now dangling limply. Just before drifting off completely, Blair mused, in the end, we all end up lying together anyway as fate would have it. Regardless of the earlier tussles, the three found themselves sharing a bed that night. The following morning, as Blair opened his eyes, he was greeted by Fred's gaze fixed on him. Upon noticing Blair was awake, Fred leaned in closer, successfully earning a morning kiss. George stirred as Blair moved, and upon realizing, he dove into George's embrace, planting a kiss on him as well. After a moment of affectionate intimacy, the trio finally remembered they had classes to attend that morning. They hastily tidied up and rushed to the Great Hall for breakfast. Having stayed up late and awakened early, all three nearly found their heads dipping into their bowls during breakfast. I swear by Merlin, I'll definitely keep better track of time from now on. Fred yawned as he spoke. The other two echoed his sentiments with their own yawns. Chapter 87, The Love Potion 2. George and Fred's research on the love potion continued. After experiencing a series of mishaps, including an accidental explosion, they finally developed a version suitable for sale. The memories of their earlier blunders remained vivid. George and Fred's experimentation table was cluttered, with everything haphazardly strewn together. Moreover, in their quest to save costs, the potion bottles they used were indistinguishable from ordinary ones. Save for the labels. Hand me the water, Fred, George instructed, fiddling with the items in his hands. Fred casually passed the water to George, who drank it only to realize he had consumed the love potion instead. Upon entering the room of requirement, Blair was met with the sight of George and Fred grappling with one another. What in Merlin's name happened? Blair inquired, observing the two. He drank the love potion. Lyle, help. Quickly pull him apart, Merlin. Fred shouted as he noticed Blair's presence. George seemed oblivious to their conversation, struggling even as Blair attempted to intervene. As George was separated, he continued to call out Fred's name. Together, Fred and Blair subdued George and resolved to temporarily petrify him. How could George have drunk the love potion? What on earth just occurred? Blair asked Fred, gazing at the petrified George. I swear by Merlin. I'll make sure to keep the table tidy during experiments from now on. Fred's response helped Blair piece together what had transpired. The two quickly set about concocting an antidote for the love potion. Fred held the antidote while Blair unraveled the binding spell. The moment Blair cast the spell, George lunged toward Fred, who was holding the antidote. Blair desperately clung to George, barely managing to restrain him. Quickly, feed it to me. I can barely hold him. Blair exclaimed, feeling as though he might tear George's clothing apart. Fred pried open George's mouth and administered the antidote. As Blair felt George's struggles begin to wane, he finally released him. George's countenance shifted from madness to despondency, ultimately darkening into a profound gloom, as if he were enveloped by a shroud of ominous clouds. Noticing the change in George's expression, Fred let out an unkind laugh. After casting a glare at him, George turned and embraced Blair, burying his face in Blair's shoulder. Blair gently stroked George's back. The previously chaotic table had transformed into a picture of neatness following the incident. After the experiment's success, George and Fred commenced selling their concoction. However, after a period of time, instead of receiving user feedback, they were met with complaints. I hadn't even had the chance to use it before it was confiscated by Felch. Felch took away my love. What a nightmare. Such complaints flooded in. And George and Fred felt it significantly impacted the sales of their love potion. We need to disguise it. Let us make it appear more commonplace. George and Fred mused as they regarded the potion before them. It could masquerade as a beverage, though its only drawback is that it could easily be mistakenly consumed. Blair chimed in, elongating the word mistakenly. George discerned the teasing undertone in her words. You promised not to mention that. You must have integrity to be a good child. Lyle, he teased, playfully pinching Blair's cheek. Blair remained silent and did not retreat. Instead, he pressed his face firmly against George's, mimicking the behavior he exhibited after consuming the potion. Blair portrayed George, while Fred stepped forward to play the role of Blair. George refused to portray Fred and seized the opportunity to plant several kisses on Blair's face. Anjuk is coming, knock. According to the script, George. Blair mumbled incoherently as George continued to affectionately pinch and kiss his face. Fred, who had initially been playing along, chose this moment to break character. He pulled George and Blair apart. Snap. The performance has come to an end, Fred declared as he separated the two. After the commotion, the trio conferred, planning to disguise the love potion as everyday items such as perfume or cough syrup. Once disguised, the sales of the love potion skyrocketed, quickly becoming the hottest product. Having sold numerous bottles without any major incidents, George began to question the potion's effectiveness. This situation is utterly implausible. Does no one use it? He pondered. The three huddled together, with George and Fred whispering in Blair's ear. It seems that while many covet it, few possess the courage to use it, Blair mused internally. Some unknown buyers contemplated, should I use it or not? It seems wasteful to buy it and not use it. Yet what if something goes awry? To use or not to use, no? Why would I buy it then? Let me reconsider. I'll check the tea leaves. Oh, today is not a good day for the love potion. Perhaps another time. Did I act rashly in purchasing it? Will they resent me once they come to their senses? I should wait. Yes, wait. Each had their own procrastination tactics, yet their ultimate decision was remarkably unified. I've decided to use it this Valentine's Day. George and Fred remained indifferent, adhering to their philosophy of selling whatever they could. Should we create an antidote? Blair inquired. This love potion's effects wear off in roughly 24 hours. Is it necessary? Fred countered. What if someone consumes it by mistake? We could profit from that too, Blair argued. Limited edition and scrupulous merchant, Lyle. George and Fred chimed in unison, their laughter echoing in Blair's ears. Though they jested, they ultimately acquiesced to Blair's suggestion. This is what we call collusion. We three are all unscrupulous merchants, and no one can criticize the other. As George and Fred embraced Blair's proposal, Blair regarded the two with a grin. Ha ha ha. Then we solemnly nominate you to be the leader of our unscrupulous merchant group. Please bestow upon us your boundless glory. George and Fred harmonized as Blair graciously accepted their nomination. You two should read fewer of the comic books I brought, Blair remarked to George and Fred. Chapter 88, The Daydream Spell. Recently, no one seemed to be dozing off in class. This was, after all, history of magic. Fred observed the surrounding students, who were forcing themselves to take notes. There is a significant exam for 5th years. You haven't forgotten, have you? Fred queried. I'm trying to keep up. Blair replied, struggling to mask his fatigue. Only Merlin knew how tired he truly was. Upon hearing this, Fred paused momentarily. Then George, echoing Blair's sentiment, whispered, "Mom warned us at the beginning of the term not to forget about the exam in June. We need to prepare diligently. If you two do poorly, you're finished." "Oh, Merlin." "Enough, George. My head is beginning to ache." Fred feigned a headache, leaning against Blair's shoulder. Blair adeptly patted his head, murmuring, "You'd best save your headache for when you actually fail. Aunt Molly 1T let you off the hook then." Fred rolled his eyes and closed them, while Blair struggled to suppress a laugh. George and Fred felt little anxiety regarding the OWL exams. However, not everyone shared such a relaxed attitude. A stifling atmosphere of pressure began to permeate even the lower years. One day, during breakfast, Ron suddenly turned to Blair and said, "Blair, don't be nervous. You'll absolutely be fine." Blair, puzzled, asked, "What makes you think I'm nervous?" "Of course you are, about the OWL exams." "You certainly don't appear to be worried," Ron replied. Before Blair could respond, Ron continued, "Hermione has been influenced by this atmosphere. She has been living in the library lately. I reckon she'd take the OWLs early if she could. I went with her once. And it was all about exam preparation." At Ron's mention of Hermione's library escapades, Blair's eyes widened in disbelief. "What do you think the odds are that Hermione could take the exam for me?" Blair asked George and Fred. "Can Hermione even duplicate herself? Perhaps she could take it for both of us." George and Fred chimed in with Ron. "Oh, Merlin. It seems you three are completely unconcerned and even have time for daydreaming," Ron remarked before returning to his breakfast. Nonetheless, the classroom atmosphere had indeed become quite oppressive. Reflecting on the classroom scenes, Blair recalled, during Defense Against the Dark Arts, someone finally snapped under the pressure. With a crack, a student called up by Professor Lupin dropped their wand, shattering their last mental defenses. Amidst tears, they exclaimed, "I can't do it. I can't even hold my wand steady. I'm bound to fail." Professor Lupin promptly assigned another student to escort them to the infirmary. The atmosphere in the classroom suddenly fell into a hush as Professor Lupin spoke soothing words. George and Fred recalled the scene from that day's lesson, and their expressions turned somewhat solemn. The OWL examinations had severely impacted Hogwarts' happiness index. George was the first to break the silence. "I believe we should do something at this moment." Fred continued, "What are you two planning to do?" Blair inquired, assuming a questioning stance. "We want to create something to alleviate everyone's anxiety," Fred replied. George murmured softly, and Blair and Fred clearly heard his words. "Ron just mentioned daydreaming. If the time spent pondering could transform into daydreaming, perhaps everyone's spirits would lift considerably." After exchanging a glance, Blair and Fred chorused, "You are a genius, George." In the following days, the trio found themselves immersed in the library. "So you finally realized the tension?" Ron asked when he spotted the three of them there. "We are researching something new," came their reply, leaving Ron speechless while Hermione facepalmed, clearly exasperated, and Harry shared a similar expression of bewilderment. To explore daydreaming, Blair delved into alchemical studies. Countless sleepless nights later, their research entered its final experimental stage. Due to some dangers involved, they vied to be the test subject. Ultimately, they decided to draw lots, as their arguments had led nowhere. Blair, who drew the lucky lot, was overjoyed, but George and Fred wore less favorable expressions. "Could you at least have a bit of faith in what we've worked hard to create?" Blair said, patting George and Fred's cheeks. Casting a spell on their concoction, Blair promptly collapsed. Fred, quick on his feet, caught him and laid him gently on the bed. For the next half hour, George and Fred remained motionless, fixated on Blair. As the 30-minute mark approached, both held their breath. When Blair opened his eyes, the two immediately called his name. "To the infirmary, Fred. Let's go." George scooped up the slightly dazed Blair and made for the door. Just as they were about to exit, George heard Blair's voice. "I'm fine. It seems this concoction has some side effects." However, George and Fred did not halt their steps. "We only trust Madame Pomfrey. Only she can say you're all right," they insisted. Despite Blair's protests, he was taken to the infirmary, where he requested to walk out on his own, only to be firmly denied by George and Fred. "You are perfectly fine. You need not be so worried, gentlemen," Madame Pomfrey assured them, finally putting George and Fred at ease. As they prepared to sell their creation, Blair suggested they note the side effects. Under high-pressure circumstances, students eager to unwind evidently did not care about the negligible side effects. Given that alchemical items were somewhat pricey, many students opted to purchase together. Thanks to the glowing reviews from fifth-year students, several seventh-year students facing their nude examinations also came to buy. George and Fred, while selling, explained the side effects and restricted sales to students in fifth year and above. Consequently, the demand for their daydreaming charms surged. "Give me one to try out. After all, the inspiration came from me, didn't it?" Ron said, eyeing the trio. "We only sell to students in fifth year and above," George and Fred replied in unison. Blair remained silent, simply nodding in agreement. "But I'm your brother. That doesn't matter, they retorted. Oh, Merlin, Ron exclaimed as he walked away. Chapter 89, Absolutely No Colds. Boom. Boom. Hosting a Quidditch match in thunderstorm conditions was pure disaster. Under the protection of an umbrella, Blair felt as if he might be struck by lightning at any moment. With blurred vision, he sprang to his feet upon seeing a figure in a red jersey plummet from the sky. Fortunately, it was merely a false alarm. The one falling was neither George nor Fred. This match was the most accident-prone Blair had ever witnessed, with players being struck by lightning, Harry's broom catching fire, and even an encounter with a Dementor. The latter half of the match had Blair on edge. After the game, upon spotting George and Fred, he dashed over and embraced them tightly, and the two reciprocated the hug. Don't worry or be afraid, Lyle. We're both perfectly fine, George and Fred reassured him. Once Blair confirmed their well-being, the trio proceeded to visit the injured. Madame Pomfrey was nearly overwhelmed in the infirmary. This sport should be banned. I must speak to Dumbledore about it. They clamored around the unconscious Harry, all chattering about his current state. His complexion is rather pale. What do you expect? He fell from such a height. Let us see you fall from the top of the tower tomorrow and see how you fare. Harry, upon waking, seemed unfazed. Even joking in the aftermath of his encounter with the Dementor, when he inquired about the match's outcome, everyone's gaze faltered. Ultimately, it was Hermione and Ron who broke the tension. Do you two really not need a pick-me-up potion? Just to be safe. As they hurried out of the infirmary, Blair asked, what about you guys? George and Fred quickly shook their heads, recalling the potion's side effects. We just got a bit of rain on us. We are absolutely not catching colds. They chimed together. Unable to resist their insistence, Blair took their hands and led them out of the infirmary. Cough. Cough. The persistent coughing disrupted Blair's sleep. Lying in bed, he opened his eyes and listened for a moment, realizing the sound came from Fred's direction. It seemed the one who would not catch a cold was George. It appears you were right. We should have taken precautions, Fred admitted between coughs. Blair hurried to pour him a glass of water. Shall we visit the infirmary tomorrow morning? He asked, patting Fred's back. No, I'll be fine by morning, Fred insisted. Let us hope so. As Blair set down the water cup, he passed by George's bed and noticed something was amiss with him. The moment he touched George's forehead, the feverish heat startled him. George, wake up, Blair called, patting George's face. George, eyes closed and brow furrowed, rubbed against Blair's palm. As the warmth spread from George's flushed face to Blair's hand, he realized that George's hair was damp. Earlier, when speaking with Fred, he had kept his voice down. But now his call stirred both Lee, who had been sleeping, and Fred, who was preparing to doze off again. What is going on, Lyle? Fred asked, startled. The voices of Fred and Lee echoed through the air. George had a fever. Blair and Lee supported George, while Fred, slightly unwell, managed to stand on his own. The four of them knocked on the infirmary door late at night. Who is it? What is happening? Came the voice of Madame Pomfrey from within. Madame Pomfrey. Someone has a fever. He is delirious from coughing. Help. The trio's cries jolted Madame Pomfrey, who had been somewhat dazed, into immediate alertness. As the infirmary door swung open, Blair and Lee hastily ushered George inside, with Fred trailing closely behind. Both of them got soaked during Quidditch today, and now he has a fever and is coughing. Blair succinctly explained to Madame Pomfrey, gesturing towards George, who was laid upon the bed, and Fred sitting beside him. Madame Pomfrey quickly fetched 2 vials of potion, handing one to Fred and the other to George. After observing them swallow the concoctions, she instructed the pair to rest in the infirmary for the night. I will stay with them. You should return and rest, Lee, Blair said after ensuring George and Fred were settled. Lee nodded at the two, now comfortably arranged, and exited the infirmary. Upon drinking the potion, George's furrowed brow relaxed, indicating he felt somewhat better. Fred, invigorated by the tonic, emitted steam from his ears at intervals, which Blair found reminiscent of a locomotive. The steam is still warm, he remarked, reaching out to touch the vapor escaping from Fred. Fred remained silent, gazing at Blair as if contemplating something profound. After a moment's hesitation between the options of embracing Blair or refraining, he decided that getting too close might risk contagion. Yet he felt an irresistible urge to hold him. I've already taken my medicine, so I should be fine. With that thought in mind, Fred grasped Blair's hand as he reached out to feel the steam, drawing him into his embrace. Fred enveloped Blair from behind, resting his head upon Blair's shoulder. I feel so unwell, Blair, he murmured softly in Blair's ear. If you're feeling ill, you should lie back down, all right? Blair gently stroked Fred's head. Fred nuzzled against Blair's shoulder, signifying his reluctance to recline. After a considerable time, Blair managed to persuade Fred to lie back down, and even then, steam continued to escape from Fred's ears. After ensuring Fred was comfortably settled, Blair tucked him in before checking on George's condition. Upon touching George's forehead, Blair's anxious heart eased. Although he was still somewhat warm, his temperature had significantly improved. Humph, George let out a soft sound, laboriously opening his eyes. Despite the effort, his hand deftly grasped Blair's. Blair, George's voice, hoarse from the fever, called out. Yes, I'm here. How are you feeling? Blair inquired, sitting at the edge of the bed while holding George's hand. My head still aches, Blair, George said, slightly shaking the hand that Blair held. Observing Blair's furrowed brow as he pondered a solution, George managed to smile. Blair thought that this expression made George appear even more feeble. George tugged on Blair's hand, pulling him onto the bed. Is it better like this? Blair asked, nestled in George's embrace. I feel much better, do you believe me? George replied, his voice still raspy. I believe you. Just close your eyes and rest well, George. Blair said, wrapping his arms around George's waist. Chapter 90. A new hairstyle. Before George could open his eyes, he sensed a pair of hands resting on his forehead. The fever has completely subsided, Blair whispered softly, feeling the coolness of George's skin. Indeed, it has fully broken. It seems only Fred is destined to catch a cold, George remarked, pulling Blair closer to him. Huh, did you not see last night? Fred was on the other bed. Neither of you escaped unscathed, Blair chuckled, looking at George. Oh, Merlin, that's just too pathetic, George said, closing his eyes once more, the sound of Blair's laughter lingering in his ears. When Fred awoke on the other bed, he found George and Blair standing by his side, seemingly engaged in conversation. What are you two talking about? Fred inquired. Ha. Blair just said you looked like a train last night, George retorted, a playful grin on his face. Fred thought George's current expression was rather deserving of a light-hearted jab. You passed out from fever, and you still have the nerve to laugh at me? Fred countered, causing George's laughter to cease abruptly. After receiving Madame Pomfrey's permission, the trio exited the infirmary. During breakfast, Harry announced several pieces of good news. Sirius bought me the latest broom after learning mine was broken, Harry exclaimed excitedly, while Ron enthusiastically described the broom's features. Wow, that is absolutely fantastic. The two chimed in unison. The most important news is that Sirius said he and the Ministry have found Peter Pettigrew, Blair remarked, gazing at Harry with wide eyes. Does that mean the Dementors will finally leave? George asked eagerly. Oh, they are finally departing. How wonderful. Fred exclaimed joyfully. That evening, Dumbledore announced this great news during the feast, prompting cheers and celebrations among the young witches and wizards. The Christmas holiday arrived as promised, and the Hogwarts Express was once again in motion. Observing George and Fred's slightly long hair, Blair felt inspired to pass the time by braiding their hair. When he mentioned that he had never braided anyone else's hair, George and Fred perked up with interest. So you've done it on yourself? They asked eagerly. We've never seen you do that. You two are a bit late to the party. My hair isn't long enough yet to braid, Blair said, running his fingers through his short locks. Disappointed, George and Fred gazed at him. Let me have my fun first, once my hair grows out. Then it will be your turn, Blair suggested, playfully tugging at Fred's somewhat longer hair. Before long, both George and Fred sported half-braided hairstyles. After finishing, Blair realized not much time had passed. Now it's our turn to braid yours, Blair, Fred announced. My hair is too short right now. That is fine. It takes time to braid it anyway, George replied. Blair looked at them. Can you both actually do it? We can give it a try, they said in unison. Ultimately, as Blair gazed into the mirror, he was met with an odd sight. His hairstyle resembled that of a ginseng doll, with his hair styled into a high ponytail, albeit only a short tuft. The atmosphere in the carriage grew quiet as Blair studied his reflection before asking, Can you tell me what you both were thinking? Why must it be on top of my head? Primarily because George and Fred stammered for quite some time without articulating their thoughts. The solution they concocted was to start anew, with Blair's singular request being that nothing be tied atop his head. Gazing out at the picturesque scenery, Blair allowed George and Fred to fuss over his hair. After a considerable flurry of activity, when Blair next peered into the mirror, his vision darkened, and he collapsed onto Fred's lap. Is it unappealing? Fred inquired, pinching one of the tufts on Blair's head. Quite adorable, Lyle, George remarked, tugging at another tuft. Like motorcycle handlebars, and you two dare call it attractive, Blair silently berated to himself. As they prepared to make another attempt, Blair put forth a second request, no two knots. With the experience of their prior endeavors, George and Fred believed they had mastered the technique. Indeed, their expectations were met, as Blair found this attempt rather satisfactory, at least in comparison to the previous two. Not bad. At least I can face the world, Blair mused as he observed his reflection. On the express train, all three sported their hair tied up. What on earth have you three been up to in this compartment? Ron asked, scrutinizing their hairstyles, while Hermione and Harry beside him struggled to stifle their laughter. Do you find it unappealing? We both tied it up, George and Fred chorused, looking at Ron expectantly. You two look all right, but Blair's hairstyle. Ron began, only to fall silent under the warning glares from George and Fred. Oh, Blair, your hair, Mrs. Weasley exclaimed, regarding him with a frown. George and Fred did this to him, Ron interjected, as Mrs. Weasley searched for the right words. Upon hearing Ron's explanation, Mrs. Weasley proceeded to pinch George and Fred's ears. Is this your idea of a prank? How could you do this? Oh, Mom. Let go, Mom. It's not a prank. We merely wanted to style Lyle's hair, George and Fred protested, struggling against her grip. Blair quickly interjected, clarifying that this was not a prank, but merely a misguided attempt at hairstyling. Our technique just needs a bit of refinement, Fred added. Mom, please don't pinch our ears again. It's quite embarrassing. All right, I apologize for misunderstanding you. However, your braiding skills are certainly lacking, Mrs. Weasley remarked, eyeing the tufts atop Blair's head. At that moment, several nearby children erupted into laughter. Lyle said we did well, Fred defended, with George echoing his sentiment. When Blair exited the station and encountered the Vance couple, their first observation was his rather peculiar hairstyle. Is this style trending in the wizarding world? Mrs. Vance queried uncertainly. Of course not, Mom. What are you thinking? Blair responded, promptly explaining the origins of his hairstyle. The only response he received was laughter from his parents. Chapter 91. Thoughts on opening a shop. On Christmas Day, at 8:35 a.m., Blair pushed open the door to the leaky cauldron, taking a moment to spot George and Fred seated beside the Christmas tree. If you can't find us soon, we shall have to stand and shout, Fred declared. George waved his hand, softly calling out Blair's name, mimicking a scenario of calling for him. Blair stifled George's voice with a homemade cotton candy treat. Is it delicious? I made it myself, he inquired while offering Fred a piece. Both Fred and George extolled the exquisite taste of Blair's cotton candy, though Blair felt they were slightly exaggerating. Nonetheless, he appreciated the praise immensely. Next came the moment for Blair to provide his critique. Ding, ding, ding. They chimed as they opened a box. Blair gazed at the cake, shaped like a Christmas tree. Your cake-making skills are truly improving. Fred handed Blair an object resembling a sieve. Sprinkle it over the cake, Lyle, George instructed. Following George's guidance, Blair shook the sieve over the cake, causing white powder to cascade onto the Christmas tree, transforming it into a snow-laden spectacle. What a clever idea you two have had. Blair chuckled at the cake. Isn't it great to feel involved? This is a joint effort, George and Fred remarked as they took turns sprinkling more snow, ultimately turning the cake into a Christmas tree buried beneath a blizzard. Ha ha ha, echoed the three of them, laughing uncontrollably at the chaos of their cake. Just before blowing out the candles, Blair suddenly pondered, Isn't that powder a bit too much? The powder, sent airborne by George and Fred, filled the air, and as Blair inhaled, he began to cough. Cough, cough, uffed, he spluttered, expelling some of the powder. After a few moments of stunned silence, George, struggling to contain his laughter, grabbed a handkerchief to wipe Blair's face, while Fred patted the powder from Blair's hair. Once they had cleaned him up, they finally dared to laugh. George and Fred leaned against Blair's shoulder, shaking with mirth. Blair playfully bumped their heads together. And after the three of them finished the cake, it was time for Blair to offer his assessment. Was it tasty, Lyle? He noticed the stars practically sparkling in their eyes. Extremely, extremely, extremely delicious, they exclaimed in unison. Yay, they cheered, celebrating their success. Soon after, the trio made their way to Diagon Alley, where George and Fred led Blair to a shop front. Lyle, what do you think of this place? Fred asked earnestly. George watched Blair intently, as if not wishing to miss a single change in his expression. Quite splendid. It would be perfect for establishing our own shop, Blair replied, taking hold of George and Fred's hands. Enveloped in their embrace, he poked at their sides, questioning. But don't you think it's a bit premature to choose a location? Well, it's not precisely about selecting a site. We merely wanted to share our concept with you, Fred whispered into Blair's ear. Right now, we are in need of affirmation and support, George added, inching closer to Blair. Feeling disheartened? Blair's inquiry opened the floodgates for their conversation. Mum discovered some orders while cleaning the house today and scolded us. She hopes we will find jobs at the Ministry of Magic after graduation, like Dad. But that kind of life sounds utterly dreary, they confessed. So we countered Mum a bit, and she seemed quite upset. Though my father does not express strong opposition to our endeavors. He and my mother share similar sentiments regarding future career choices. George and Fred exchanged their reflections on the rejections they received today, articulating their feelings in a back-and-forth manner. Meanwhile, Blair listened intently, holding both of them close. We had made considerable progress, yet upon arriving at this juncture, they decided to confide in me about the grievances they had faced today. Blair spoke up. It's not really a grievance, is it? Not a grievance? So, that means you don't require consolation. Blair emphasized the word not with a hint of insistence. Still, a little would be nice, George interjected, echoing Blair's sentiment. Indeed, Fred concurred. A flurry of thoughts fluttered in Blair's mind, and the first to escape his lips was, I believe in you, just as I said from the very beginning. This place is perfect for opening a shop of our own. Upon uttering those words, Blair noticed the corners of George and Fred's eyes beginning to glisten with unshed tears. The expressions on their faces compelled Blair to consider the possibility of securing the shop right then and there. "Do you want to head back home tonight?" Blair inquired. Observing their earlier descriptions had painted a rather dismal scenario. Their expressions spoke volumes, and so Blair guided them back home, having both lived there for an extended period. They found everything in order except for their clothing. George and Fred donned Blair's old pajamas and gazed into the mirror, while Blair's laughter rang out from behind them. The old pajamas, worn by George and Fred, inadvertently created a crop top effect. "Not flattering, is it, Lyle?" Fred asked knowingly. "If I say it looks good, would you two believe me?" Blair countered. "No," George replied, continuing Blair's train of thought. Following George's remark, Blair laughed even more heartily. After settling into bed, Blair realized that it was he who was being tormented by George and Fred wearing crop tops. As before, George and Fred enjoyed grasping Blair's hand and placing it on their stomachs. What Blair expected to feel was the fabric of their clothing, but this time, he encountered their toned abs. He contemplated shifting his hand, but George and Fred denied him that opportunity. Ultimately, adhering to the principle of not passing up an opportunity, Blair meticulously traced the contours of their abs with his fingers. The once relaxed muscles of George and Fred gradually tightened, and Blair sensed their breaths growing heavier. When he realized his own thoughts were beginning to wander, he decided to withdraw. However, George and Fred were not in agreement. George restrained Blair's retreating hand and captured his lips with his own. Seizing the moment, Fred began kissing Blair's hand. Chapter 92, A Perfect Day. The Burrow, Christmas Day, 11:20 a.m. Ron tiptoed towards the owl, letter in hand, destined for George and Fred. It was Juwagen, the owl that Sirius had gifted to Ron. Just as Ron was about to call out, he heard someone shout his name from behind. As he turned in alarm, a hand covered his mouth. "Don't shout, it's me," Ginny whispered, her hand over Ron's mouth. Upon recognizing Ginny, Ron released a sigh of relief, placing his hand over his heart. "Oh, Merlin, were you trying to give me a heart attack?" Ginny made a shushing gesture and asked, "Are you also sending a letter to Fred and George?" Ron nodded, and Ginny placed her letter alongside his. Knock, knock, knock. The trio, who had just drifted into slumber, was jolted awake by a series of knocks on the window. Blair covered his ears and burrowed under the covers, while George and Fred, with looks of annoyance, opened the window. One of them retrieved a letter and returned to bed. Upon feeling the indentations on either side of him, Blair inquired, "What's that?" "It's from Ron and Ginny," George and Fred replied as they leaned back on the bed. Blair yawned and sat up, asking, "What does it say?" George and Fred were already engrossed in the letters, with George holding Ginny's and Fred holding Ron's. Ginny recounted the events following their departure, stating, "Mom, I feel we need to have a serious talk with Mom and Dad." "We definitely will." "What did Ron say?" Blair pressed on. "Huh. He asked if this is a temporary escape or if we're eloping with you," Fred chuckled. Blair looked at Fred with a bemused expression. "If it's an elopement, can we claim the things in our room?" Hearing the last part, Blair leaned back against the headboard, laughing. "Are you two going to write back and tell Ron not to daydream?" George and Fred exchanged glances before responding. "We've decided to return tomorrow and tell him in person not to daydream." George continued. "Then we'll have a proper discussion with Mom and Dad." "So can we go back to sleep now?" Blair asked, leaning his head back against the headboard. Fred wrapped an arm around Blair as they lay back down. But George found himself restless, contemplating how to approach the conversation with their parents. As he was lost in thought, Blair gently patted his shoulder and intertwined his arm with George's, offering gentle encouragement. The following morning, as the three descended the stairs, they encountered Mrs. Weasley, who was preparing to wake Blair. "Good morning, Mom." "Good morning, Annie." X2. "Good morning to you too." Observing Mrs. Weasley's hesitant expression, George and Fred exchanged worried looks regarding their attire. X2. The two dashed back to their room, pulling Blair along. Watching the three retreat, Mrs. Weasley smiled and went downstairs to prepare 2 more breakfasts. As Blair reflected on the earlier scene, he leaned against Fred, laughing to the point of breathlessness. Fred held him steady to prevent him from falling, while George patted his back to help him regain his composure. When the trio reappeared before Mrs. Weasley, they were now properly dressed. "I heard a noise. Dad should be back soon. Good luck to us, Lyle." Back in their room at the Burrow, George and Fred spoke to Blair through the two-way mirror. "Good luck to you," Blair replied, and after he finished speaking, George and Fred lowered the mirror while Blair placed his on the bed. During the waiting period, Blair repeatedly picked up and set down the mirror. On the nth cycle, he sensed movement emanating from the mirror. "Lyle, Lyle, Lyle." The repeated calls echoed from the mirror. Blair, clutching the mirror, quickly sat up in bed. "What is happening? What is happening?" he eagerly inquired. "Mom and Dad have made a request regarding the OWL and NEWT exams," George and Fred said, looking at Blair through the mirror. In case you do not succeed, you should still be able to secure stable employment. If the venture fails and you lack good grades, the future could be quite burdensome. These are the concerns of the Weasley couple. Did you agree?" "Certainly." We firmly believe that it is entirely feasible to pursue entrepreneurship while simultaneously managing our studies. Both of us are brimming with confidence, Fred and George remarked, casting a glance at Blair. With half a year remaining until the OWL examinations, as soon as the holiday concludes, we shall immerse ourselves in the library, Blair calculated. George and Fred nodded in agreement from across the room. Did you two mention anything else? Blair inquired, noticing their hesitant demeanor. After a brief silence, Fred spoke up. We also discussed our plans with Mom and Dad. You combined those two matters? Blair responded, inhaling deeply. Both of these issues are of great significance. George interjected. Fred continued. When we shared our news, our parents' expressions were quite blank. Once they regained their senses, both Fred and I received a rather heartfelt lecture. As George recounted the scene, he animatedly gestured with his hands. I truly wonder what they were thinking. They actually believed you were being coerced. Do we really come across as such jerks? George and Fred chimed in, with Fred rolling his eyes at the end. Not jerks, quite the opposite, Blair replied, gazing at the two in the mirror. Ultimately, the outcome is entrepreneurship alongside you. Our parents are aware and have expressed their understanding and support, George and Fred concluded. What a perfect day, Blair exclaimed, performing a celebratory gesture, with George and Fred mimicking him. Didn't you say you received a heartfelt lecture? Yet, I see no signs of injury, Blair quipped, shifting to gossip after addressing serious matters. Fred, upon hearing Blair's question, rolled up his sleeves. Because in the unseen places. George revealed the marks of his reprimand on his back and added, we seemed to shout "Don't hit our faces." At the time, Mom and Dad must have heard us. In fact, I would say everyone in the house heard us, Fred supplemented. Ron and Ginny were eavesdropping at the door after we entered our room, George reminisced. Come on. They've gone in. Ron beckoned Ginny. After a moment of hesitation, she joined him. Thud. Ron and Ginny turned towards the sound, spotting Percy passing by. After exchanging glances, they decided to pull Percy along, who offered a token resistance. Ultimately, the three of them pressed themselves against the door, eavesdropping. Chapter 93, A Valentine's Day Heist. Following the conclusion of the Christmas holidays, the trio's campus life settled into a remarkably structured routine. Aside from attending classes, they spent their days in the library. Evenings were dedicated to research in the room of requirement, followed by rest. This has been the most disciplined period of my life in over a decade, Blair remarked. A sentiment echoed by Fred and George. On the first day of their disciplined endeavor, however, they struggled to find their rhythm while immersed in the library. Fred glanced at the methods documented in his book and murmured, this spell seems intriguing, just as he was about to share his thoughts with the others. He noticed Blair and George looking at him with exasperation. Quietly, Fred closed the book titled The Mad Magic of Odd Wizards. George proposed 3 new ideas in the library, while Fred contributed 5. Although their minds were devoid of academic knowledge, innovative product concepts flowed freely from them. Blair, head bowed over his notebook, diligently recorded their brainstormed ideas. It appears the library can indeed ignite our inspiration. Had we known, we would have come here much sooner, George observed, glancing at the 8 new ideas noted by Blair. Who would have thought the library could have such an effect? Blair chuckled, glancing at the unopened books and the scribbled notes in his notebook. This is more than we managed to conceive in an entire week previously, Fred recalled. The atmosphere in the room of requirement during the evening was markedly more pleasant than that of the library. The trio worked efficiently and harmoniously, processing the recent orders. On the nth day of their revision, they finally found their stride. Although bursts of inspiration still occurred sporadically, they had learned to coordinate their efforts effectively. On Valentine's Day, after much deliberation, the trio decided to indulge themselves for a day. The room of requirement transformed into an unprecedentedly romantic setting. Blair entered first and marveled at the scene within, exclaiming, "Wow, Merlin, it feels as though I am under attack by pink bubbles." As he spoke, Blair feigned being overwhelmed and fell into the embrace of the person behind him. With one hand occupied, George swiftly caught Blair with the other. "This is called ambience, Blair," George said, rubbing his chin against the top of Blair's head before whispering in his ear. Once Fred entered, he guided Blair to the round table, where a candlelit dinner awaited. "The atmosphere is perfect," Fred said, as George arranged the food on the table and lighted the candles. Blair fiddled with the nearby gramophone, and soon, melodious music filled the air, mingling with the enticing aroma of their feast. Under the flickering candlelight, the trio savored their meal. Fred and George had considered bringing wine, as they associated candlelit dinners with it. However, they quickly recalled Blair's limited tolerance for alcohol. "What does it matter if we drink? You don't drink, so it doesn't concern you," Blair reassured them, aware of their apprehensions. "If we were to drink and then kiss you, given your tolerance, you would surely be inebriated, wouldn't you, Blair?" Fred and George chimed in unison. Upon hearing their words, Blair fell into a prolonged silence, seemingly contemplating the probability of such a scenario. Observing his deep thought, Fred and George found it quite amusing. They each planted a kiss on Blair's cheek and simultaneously asked, "Is that likely to happen, Blair?" Blair considered the likelihood to be fairly high but felt embarrassed to voice it, his expression twisting into a conflicted grimace. George and Fred chuckled at the changing expressions on Blair's face. "You two can refrain from kissing," Blair shot back, turning on his heel to leave. Naturally, George and Fred would not engage in such a trivial endeavor. After dinner, as Blair listened to the music, he reminisced about the Yule Ball held during the Triwizard Tournament. "Can either of you dance?" Blair asked, feeling a surge of inspiration as he turned to George and Fred. George noticed the twinkle of excitement in Blair's eyes, while Fred, without hesitation, stood up and took Blair's hand, intending to demonstrate his dancing skills. However, without prior agreement on who would lead which role, they nearly tripped each other as they extended their feet. George quickly rose to stabilize them both. "Dance with me, Blair. I can do either the lead or follow," George declared, placing his hand on Blair's shoulder. Fred, with a puzzled expression, turned to his brother. "Since when can you follow? I was unaware of this." George raised an eyebrow at Fred. "As long as I mirror Blair's movements, I can improvise the rest." In the end, the three of them ingeniously created a dance suitable for their trio. Blair led George and Fred, with his part being exceedingly simple. However, George and Fred's segments were rather intricate, filled with spins and leaps. Oblivious to the unfolding chaos outside, the trio reveled in their merriment within the room of requirement. Those who had previously acquired the love potion from them had, with remarkable synchrony, chosen to use it on Valentine's Day. Consequently, the number of couples at Hogwarts surged, leading to a somewhat chaotic scene. There were instances of potion misadministration and various bizarre situations arising. When the three decided to rendezvous elsewhere, they discovered that the relationships among Hogwarts students had become unprecedentedly convoluted. "Do you remember the love potions we sold earlier?" Blair inquired, observing the tumultuous scene. After exchanging knowing glances, the trio hastily rushed to retrieve the antidote they had previously concocted, acutely aware that even a moment's delay could result in the delirious crowd wreaking havoc at Hogwarts. More importantly, if any mishap were to occur, the discoverers, namely the professors and the headmaster, would certainly hold them accountable as the sellers. They needed to move swiftly, their thoughts aligned in unison. By Merlin's grace, the crisis born from the love potion was averted. The trio's approach to selling the potion grew increasingly cautious. After all, the mass utilization of such an elixir appeared rather alarming. A throng of bewildered individuals, murmuring their infatuations, exhibited rather aggressive behaviors. It was nothing short of a nightmare. Once the crisis was averted, Blair leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the earlier events. "Agreed," George and Fred chimed in unison. "In the future, we must refrain from selling the love potion on such a grand scale," George remarked, patting Fred on the back. Fred nodded in agreement, acknowledging the dire consequences they had narrowly escaped. Thankfully, they had prepared the antidote in advance. "That was a close call. Valentine's Day nearly turned into a catastrophe," Blair said, clapping both their shoulders. Chapter 94, Collapse. Blair, utterly disenchanted, rested his head on the desk, his arms pressing down on his potions textbook. "Lyle, you currently resemble a wilting flower," George remarked, reaching out to touch Blair's face, who then turned to plant a gentle kiss on his palm. Observing George's dark circles, Blair commented, "You appear as though you've been in a brawl, George." Fred chuckled softly at Blair's observation. "You're hardly in a better state, Fred. If you keep laughing, Madame Pants will surely throw us out again." Fred, catching Madame Pants's gaze, quickly covered his mouth. A regimented lifestyle can sometimes lead to a state of despondency. Within the room of requirement that night, Blair suddenly felt a rebellious urge. He had grown weary of this disciplined existence, sensing that George and Fred shared his sentiments. "Let us embark on a nighttime adventure." After a lengthy pause, George and Fred eagerly nodded at Blair's suggestion. Blair found their resolute agreement particularly reassuring. "If this continues, I fear I may lose my sanity," Fred lamented, squatting before Blair. Blair affectionately ruffled his hair. "I feel the same. This existence is unbearable." George, in response to Blair's words, feigned weeping theatrically. Blair took his hand and patted it. "Our recent fervor seems to be steering us toward chaos." Blair observed the two before him. After a moment of reflection, George and Fred realized the truth in his words. The three of them concluded that there was no merit in enduring such self-imposed torment. "So how did you both initially perceive this?" "It's quite remarkable that you've managed to endure thus far," Blair queried. The two, caught in their own thoughts, fumbled for words. "After our mother expressed her expectations, we instinctively aimed to excel. After all, the matters we discussed that day were of utmost importance," they explained. Blair emphasized, "Aunt Molly and Uncle Arthur simply wish for you to take things seriously. They do not desire to overwhelm you." Emerging from their mental labyrinth, the two seized Blair's hands and dashed out of the room of requirement. After being cooped up for so long, they burst forth into the night. reveling in their newfound freedom. Blair mused that their exuberance was only short of shouting, "We are free." As they explored, they eventually sprinted out of the castle, embracing the wind and the sensation of liberation. "If anyone were to see us lying on the lawn at this hour, they would surely think us mad," Blair remarked, resting his head on their arms. George and Fred leaned closer, whispering, "This is freedom. Because of your subconscious actions, you have lost it." Blair attempted to interject, but Fred playfully silenced him. "Freedom," Fred repeated, releasing Blair, who then mumbled in protest. George drew Blair closer, enveloping him in an embrace, his lips trailing from Blair's forehead to his chin, causing him to squirm slightly. Dazedly, Blair gazed at the moon, reflecting on how he had rolled along their arms moments earlier. "The moon is particularly full tonight," he mused softly. "The day when werewolves transform." George recalled the points from their defense against the dark arts syllabus. Fred winced at the thought, shutting his eyes. "Oh, Merlin, spare us, George, my head is pounding." As Blair admired the full moon, he placed a hand on Fred's head. "Full moon, Professor Lupin." Blair suddenly sprang up from the embrace of George and Fred. However, he quickly lay back down, leaving George and Fred somewhat bewildered. Upon returning to his previous position, he patted both their heads to assure them he was fine. Without Peter Pettigrew, Professor Lupin would not forget to take his wolfsbane potion. Blair shivered as the wind chilled him, prompting George to suggest they return to their dormitory. Looking at the long unseen bed, all three felt a wave of nostalgia. "Tomorrow morning, we have no classes. No one can separate me from my bed," Blair whispered, gazing longingly at his mattress. George and Fred shared the same sentiment, and that night, they slept soundly. The next morning, Lee awoke and was momentarily taken aback by the sight of three sleeping figures in their beds. "Has Merlin intervened? I had nearly forgotten I had 3 roommates," Lee remarked softly as he sat on his bed. Seeing the trio slumbering peacefully, he decided to indulge in a bit more sleep, hoping that upon waking, he would not discover it had all been a dream. As he drifted off again, he murmured to himself. When he finally roused, the sight of 3 heads confirmed that everything he had seen prior was indeed real. "I thought you all had forgotten that Hogwarts is a boarding school," Lee yawned. "How does it feel to be alone in the dormitory?" Blair inquired, looking at Lee. "Like being at home. I've nearly forgotten I had roommates," Lee replied. Fred pointed at the somewhat disheveled dormitory. "Is this the reason you left the dorm in such disarray?" "Lee," he teased. Lee, glancing at the chaos he had created, sheepishly admitted, "Ahem, I'll tidy up once I get out of bed." After speaking, the 3 individuals before him shared a few awkward chuckles. Upon their return last night, the trio had failed to notice the disarray within their dormitory, shrouded in darkness. Their minds were solely preoccupied with the long-separated beds. Blair awoke that morning, seated on his bed, contemplating the chaotic surroundings, and thought to himself, "Oh, Merlin, surely I have yet to fully awaken. I shall indulge in a little more slumber." With that, he reclined once more. George and Fred, roused from their slumber, shared a similar sentiment as they surveyed the untidy dormitory. When the 3 opened their eyes again, they realized this was no mere illusion. Having not returned to their quarters recently, the instigator was glaringly apparent. Standing by Lee's bed, they regarded the culprit, who, sensing their gaze, swiftly awoke. While tidying up, Lee heard Blair remark, "I thought I was still dreaming when I saw the 3 of you lying in bed." To which he added, "Had I known you were returning." Under the reproachful gazes of the trio, Lee promptly sealed his lips. During lunch, Ron observed the lethargic George and Fred and remarked, "Have you given up? I assumed you would earn your 12 OWL certificates like Percy and Bill." In response to Ron's standing and seemingly unperturbed demeanor, George and Fred each delivered a playful punch to him, insisting he also practice self-discipline for a few days. When Hermione encountered Ron in the library, she thought the world was coming to an end. Chapter 95, April Fool's Day. On the morning of April Fool's Day, Harry cautiously opened the package sent to him by Sirius while seated at the long table. Upon unveiling its contents, a shout erupted from him. "Oh, Merlin!" Harry's exclamation caught Blair's attention. He leaned towards his companions and whispered, "I wager it's a gift from Sirius." George and Fred chimed in. "It could also be from Ron, as he asked us for some items yesterday." Blair continued, "Did you see the owl that delivered the gift?" Fred, draping his arm over Blair's shoulder, replied, seeing it would be pointless Lyle. Perplexed, Blair looked at him, and George whispered an explanation in his ear. "Ron S. Curran Owl is a gift from Sirius and resembles Sirius S. Owl quite closely." "Oh, very well," Blair responded upon hearing this. Amidst the 4 long tables, explosions and gasps occasionally erupted, drawing the attention of Professor Lupin, who noted Harry's situation. He then glanced at the gift placed before him. "Perhaps I shall deal with this in my office later." Lupin mused, believing that the gift from Sirius was likely more perilous than the one sent to Harry. When he looked back at Harry, he noticed Harry was also watching him. The expression on Harry's face seemed to convey, "Are you truly not going to open it? Am I the only one who suffers?" From Harry's expression, Lupin discerned this sentiment. Under Harry's gaze, he tucked away the gift from Sirius. Disappointment clouded Harry's features. A sentiment echoed by Blair, George, and Fred, who had been observing the interaction. I was hoping to witness a mishap on the professor's table, Fred remarked as he turned away. Such a pity. Though sending a prank gift to a professor is a splendid idea, George added in agreement. Who do you two intend to send it to? Professor McGonagall or Professor Snape? Blair inquired, prompting George and Fred to imagine the aftermath. Professor McGonagall would be like an enraged lion, while Professor Snape would be far more terrifying. Under Blair's watchful gaze, George and Fred shook their heads vigorously. Blair reached out to still their bobbing heads. Feeling dizzy? He asked, observing their antics. In unison, George and Fred replied, dizzy. They leaned against Blair's shoulder. At that moment, an owl swooped down in front of the trio. Lyle, do you recognize this owl? George asked, eyeing the owl, which appeared somewhat familiar to Blair. Blair fed it some nuts, stroked its feathers, and stated, this is a birthday gift for both of you. At Blair's words, George and Fred stared at the owl in stunned silence. A birthday gift for us? An owl that belongs to us? They murmured. I procured it from Diagon Alley during Christmas. I arranged with the shopkeeper for this little one to arrive on April Fool's Day. How about we give it a name? Blair suggested, nudging the dazed duo. In the next moment, Blair felt as though he were being strangled, as George and Fred's arms encircled his neck. Clearly, space was insufficient, and their voices rang in Blair's ears. Give me some room, George. Huh, why don't you give me some room, Fred? Blair feigned asphyxiation, swatting at their arms. The owl on the long table pecked at George and Fred's arms. With this, Blair was liberated, though the owl suffered at the hands of the two. What shall we name it? Blair listened as the duo muttered to one another. He resumed his breakfast while George and Fred conferred behind him about the owl's name. By nightfall, when Blair learned of the name they had chosen, he was utterly taken aback. Are you two saying you spent all day thinking, and this owl is ultimately named Fool? Blair queried, incredulously eyeing the pair. It could also be called April Fool's Day, Fred responded. George chimed in. Isn't that quite commemorative? Fofolo? Merlin. Blair thought to himself, exasperated. Are you implying that I chose this seemingly intelligent screech owl, and it's ultimately named Fool? He collapsed onto his bed, staring at the ceiling before finally closing his eyes. Though Blair struggled to accept it at first, the owl seemed to embrace its name with joy. Great wisdom often appears foolish, Blair repeated silently to himself. When Lee returned to the dormitory and saw Fool, he inquired of the trio, what is the owl's name? Fool. They replied in unison. Lee looked at them, puzzled. After shouting the name at Lee, Blair suddenly understood George and Fred's mischievous humor. Are the three of you mocking me? Lee asked, bewildered. The trio chuckled as they explained the origin of the name. Upon hearing their reasoning, Lee grasped their playful intentions and found it amusing. Tomorrow, let me introduce Fool to others. The following day, Lee indeed took Fool out and introduced it to everyone. In the common room, Hermione, Harry, and Ron became his targets. After learning the backstory, Hermione rolled her eyes, as if to suggest Lee was the fool. Upon understanding the context, Ron found the naming convention rather cool. Blair silently mourned for his beloved Juvie, wondering what name he might bestow upon her. Fortunately, Harry did not entertain the thought of renaming Hedwig. Otherwise, Blair would have deemed it a grave injustice. Ultimately, under the enthusiastic promotion of Lee and Ron, it took mere days for the entire Hogwarts community to become acquainted with the owl named Fool 39. Oh, our Fool has risen to fame. It has become a renowned owl. George and Fred, stroking Fool, proclaimed in harmonious unison before it. During the days Fool spent with its masters, Blair felt that the creature appeared rather dim-witted. Mercy. It had once seemed such an intelligent owl, Blair remarked, observing the interaction between the two boys and the owl. George and Fred covered Fool's ears and feigned indignation as they glanced towards Blair. How could one speak of its lack of intelligence in front of a child? This was the meaning that Blair discerned from their expressions. Blair pondered, have I become the villain? Chapter 96. The OWL examination. The examination week arrived as scheduled, and on Monday afternoon, Blair was engaged in the practical portion of charms under the watchful gaze of the examiner, Professor Tofty. Blair cast spells causing the egg cup to perform several sideways flips, followed by demonstrations of the levitation charm, the color change charm, and the growth charm. Slightly anxious, Blair concluded his display and turned to Professor Tofty, who was a seasoned examiner. However, Blair could glean nothing from his expression. You may step out and call in the next candidate, Professor Tofty instructed. Upon exiting the classroom, Blair let out a long sigh of relief. It's your turn. Good luck, mate, Blair said to the next candidate, who took a deep breath, nodded at Blair, and entered the examination room. His posture was remarkably steadfast, resembling that of a soldier heading into battle rather than a student entering an exam. Merlin, please bless me. Oh God, Merlin. A chorus of various prayers erupted from the line of students, forming spontaneously. Following the cue, Blair found George and Fred. "You've got this. I'll be waiting over there," Blair encouraged, gesturing with both hands in a cheering motion, pointing in a certain direction. "Is something missing?" George and Fred seemed to convey with their expressions. With a smile, Blair stepped forward and embraced both of them. After finishing his exam, Fred sprinted towards Blair, who was seated on a bench, opening his arms wide. As Fred approached, he leapt directly into Blair's embrace. Blair could not withstand the impact and was toppled onto the bench. This unexpected scenario left both of them momentarily speechless. Blair nudged Fred, saying, "Is this angle to your liking? Aren't you getting up?" After Fred stood, he leaned closer to Blair's ear and said, "It's indeed quite delightful, Lyle." Blair playfully swatted Fred on the head. "Oh, Lyle, you've made me daft. This is the time I need my wits most." Fred clutched his head in jest. Blair laughed so hard that he leaned back, and Fred reached out to pull him back up. When George exited the classroom, he too dashed towards Blair. As George approached, Blair found his movements increasingly familiar. "Stop," Blair called out, and in the next moment, he once again found himself in an intimate encounter with the bench. George swiftly rose and helped Blair up. Blair's expression shifted rapidly before settling into one of resigned exasperation. He thought to himself, once is a tumble, twice is still a tumble. What are you pondering, Lyle?" An oblivious George asked, pinching Blair's cheek. Blair looked at George and prepared to pat his head in return. The pat caught George off guard, and Fred began to laugh beside them. "You've made him daft, Lyle. Perhaps save the pats for later. You need your wits about you." George's words only added to Blair's frustration, prompting him to roll his eyes and head towards the common room. George and Fred trailed behind, and in an effort to resolve his confusion, George conferred with Fred. After their discussion, George finally understood why Blair appeared so perplexed. "What did you all take today?" Hermione inquired as the three entered the common room. The written exam covered the levitation charm, the joy charm, and the burping charm. Blair enumerated, counting on his fingers. The more he spoke, the brighter Hermione's eyes became. "You know all of this," Blair asserted confidently. Hermione nodded. And Blair turned to George and Fred, exclaiming, "Genius. You could sit the exams for us. Is it too late for us to brew polyjuice potion?" George and Fred asked Hermione. While the idea was utterly impractical, Harry and Ron, who were eavesdropping, took note. "Let us figure out how to make Hermione duplicate herself. Shall we, mate?" Ron suggested to Harry. "Then we can have her drink polyjuice potion and sit the exams for us," Harry added. Hermione responded with exasperation. "If you two manage to figure out how to make me duplicate myself, then you two need not worry about the exams at all." After discussing the practical exams they had undertaken, the trio returned to their dormitories to review the material for transfiguration. The OWL examination stretched on for nearly 2 weeks, with history of magic being the final subject. As Blair exited the examination room, he felt as though his very soul had been liberated. "What had I just taken?" he mused inwardly. "I cannot recall," Blair responded to himself. "I must have handed in my brain along with the exam paper." Observing George and Fred rushing out, Blair posed the same question to them. "What did we just take?" I don't remember either," Fred replied, glancing at Blair. George defended. "The history of magic questions were so lengthy. It's hard to remember, all right? I don't recall either." In the common room, Hermione once again inquired about what they had covered in history of magic. "Don't remember," they chorused in unison. Hermione regarded the three of them with a look of confusion, which sharply contrasted with the agreement evident on Harry and Ron's faces. In mid-July, an owl arrived at the burrow bearing the exam results for George and Fred. Upon receiving their results, they handed them directly to Mrs. Weasley. "Mom, just open it. All we need is for you to tell us whether you're satisfied," George and Fred said in unison. Their behavior caused Mrs. Weasley to grow increasingly anxious. The trio's voices attracted all the children present at home, creating an unusually tense atmosphere in the burrow. As Mrs. Weasley reviewed the results, Ron and Ginny dashed to her side. Fred and George closed their eyes, awaiting Mrs. Weasley's verdict, only to be met with a large embrace from her a moment later. "Oh, it appears we have met the standard you and Dad set, Mom. Therefore, you and Dad must remember to honor your promises to us," George and Fred chimed together. Mrs. Weasley affirmed that her word was her bond. Subsequently, George and Fred received heartfelt congratulations from Ron and Ginny. Percy, remarkably, offered praise to George and Fred. After being celebrated by an entire room, the two were somewhat elated. However, they did not forget to use the two-way mirror to inquire about Blair's exam results. "It went quite well, just as I anticipated," came Blair's voice from the mirror. "The OWL exams have concluded splendidly," the trio exclaimed in unison. After sharing the examination results, George and Fred extended an invitation to Blair. "Blair, would you care to join us for the Quidditch World Cup? On August 22nd, we vow it will be immensely entertaining," George and Fred chimed in. Glancing at Blair in the mirror, "I would love to. Is there anything I need to prepare?" Blair inquired. "Yay," echoed George and Fred's celebratory voices from the mirror. "Aside from clothing, there shouldn't be much to prepare," Fred pondered before replying. We'll come to fetch you on the 21st, George added. Their exuberance nearly overflowed from the mirror. Blair decided to inform his parents about his plans, and, while he had saved some money, he felt it prudent to ask for sponsorship. Are you daydreaming, son? The World Cup has already concluded, or I wouldn't be home, Mr. Vance remarked, looking at Blair. Not the Football World Cup. Do you remember me mentioning the Quidditch one? Blair clarified. You mean their SA World Cup in the Wizarding World? Which countries participate? Does Brazil take part? Blair was genuinely unaware of the teams involved. So he looked at Mr. Vance for answers. I don't know. Ultimately, Mr. Vance decided to sponsor Blair. If there's any betting involved, wager on Brazil, he advised. To which Blair readily agreed. On the night of August 21st, in the twins' room on the 3rd floor of the Burrow, Blair was drowsy while George and Fred were brimming with energy. Knowledge about the Irish national team and the Quidditch World Cup flooded Blair's mind. If Dad were to ask me about the teams now, I could certainly provide a proper answer, Blair thought. Eventually, clad in his pajamas, he sat on the bed, propping his face with his hands, and fell asleep. Shoo, Fred, Lal has dozed off, George whispered, tapping Fred's shoulder and pointing at Blair. Oh, Lal has been hypnotized, Fred murmured. It seems our conversation was too dull for him, George added. As George spoke, he noticed Blair's head wobbling as he propped it up. He swiftly steadied Blair, who woke up and recalled what the twins had been discussing before he fell asleep. So, the reigning champions are Canada, Blair blinked, stating. Oh, Lyle, forget about Canada. You look utterly exhausted, Fred said, ruffling Blair's hair. I'm fine, not that tired, Blair replied, stifling a yawn. Determined to prove his words held merit, he rejected George's offer of support and stood up, only to kneel back onto the bed due to his numb legs. The awkwardness jolted Blair awake, yet he was reluctant to face the embarrassing situation. Finally, he shut his eyes and collapsed into George's embrace, subsequently burrowing under the covers and pretending to be asleep. George and Fred, who had witnessed the entire scene, wanted to laugh but understood that doing so would irk Blair and prevent him from sleeping, so they restrained themselves. George and Fred lay on either side of Blair, gently tugging him from the covers. The warmth of the blankets beckoned Blair back to slumber. Good night, he murmured softly. George and Fred kissed his cheeks, and upon receiving their affection, Blair promptly switched off. The following morning, as dawn broke, Ginny knocked on the door, calling, Wake up. Mum says breakfast is ready. Fred and George, did you hear me? Got it, Fred replied from the bed, his voice barely audible. Ginny, not having heard clearly, called again from the doorway. Understood. Ginny, you may go and wake others now, George responded loudly from his bed. Blair, covering his ears with his hands, leaned against Fred, who instinctively pulled him closer. Once George got up, he turned around to find Fred still asleep, or perhaps he had never really awakened, while cradling Blair. He nudged Fred awake, then gently pulled Blair's hands away from his ears and softly roused him. After breakfast, the group, laden with luggage, followed Mr. Weasley in a state of confusion. The children were eager to learn their destination, yet the response was vague. George and Fred held on to Blair tightly, fearing he might fall behind, despite his assurances that it would never happen. Upon reuniting with the Diggory father and son, their numbers swelled. At the sight of the portkey, Blair understood they could finally take a breather. George and Fred introduced the portkey to Harry, then guided Blair to place his hand on it. Suddenly, they were whirling through space, and Mr. Weasley called out, Let go, children. What? Hermione exclaimed. As everyone released their grip in succession, Blair caught George, while Fred grasped Blair, resulting in the three tumbling to the ground in a line. Compared to the others' clumsiness, Mr. Weasley and the Diggorys landed with grace. Rising from the ground, Blair found the portkey quite exhilarating. Of course, a softer landing would have been preferable. Upon entering the tent, Blair echoed Harry's sentiments, exclaiming, I love magic. Oh, Lyle, you've never told us that before, Fred remarked, shouldering his bag as he gazed at Blair. Didn't I? Blair instinctively retorted. You never did, Fred insisted, staring intently at Blair. I love you, baby, Blair replied to Fred. I love you too, Fred responded with a smile. George pulled Blair closer. Gazing at him expectantly, Blair stepped forward to embrace him, saying, I love you, sweetie. George whispered back in Blair's ear, I love you too. What do you mean by baby and sweetie? Ron exclaimed, incredulous at their exchange. Hermione swiftly covered Ron's mouth before he could say anything further. Ginny kicked Ron lightly and, together with Hermione, pulled him away. As Ginny led Ron off, they quietly debated something, leaving Blair and the twins unable to hear. Yet, Ron's question resonated clearly with the trio. Do you think this is romantic, Ginny? Oh, Hermione, you don't think it's romantic too? Fred hurled the backpack strapped to his back at Ron, causing Ron to stagger and inadvertently release Ginny and Hermione's hands. Oh, Ron's exclamation pierced the air. Mr. Weasley poked his head out from the room, his expression one of bewilderment. What on earth are you doing on the ground, Ron? Ginny and Hermione erupted into laughter at his predicament. Chapter 98. The conclusion of the match. On the morning of the final, Ludo Bagman expressed his desire to wager with us, betting on which team would emerge victorious, promising a substantial reward if we won. George and Fred eagerly relayed this to Blair, their eyes sparkling with anticipation. Ludo Bagman? You might want to ascertain his reliability first, Blair advised, contemplating Bagman's dubious reputation. The prospect of a handsome payout momentarily sobered George and Fred. Come on, let us consult Uncle Arthur, Blair suggested, leading the duo to seek out Mr. Weasley. The instant Fred uttered Bagman's name, Mr. Weasley interrupted, exclaiming, "Oh, he wishes to bet with you? He must truly be mad, even preying upon children." Mr. Weasley's words awakened George and Fred to the unsettling reality that Bagman might not be a trustworthy individual. As George and Fred were momentarily taken aback, Mr. Weasley was already preparing to confront Bagman. "Dad, we haven't placed a bet yet," George and Fred chorused, grasping at the seemingly irate Mr. Weasley. Blair swiftly intervened, elucidating the situation to Mr. Weasley. "So what exactly has he done, Dad?" Fred inquired, looking at the now composed Mr. Weasley. "It's not uncommon for him to owe money without repayment. He would even dare to default on goblin currency," Mr. Weasley replied, eyeing the three children. "If he wins, your money is his. If he loses, he has no funds to return to you. You might end up with goblin coins, remember? The ones that vanish after a few hours." Mr. Weasley's words illuminated the folly of George and Fred's previous thoughts, leaving them rather despondent as they confronted the harsh realities of society. "Fortunately, you didn't give him any money, did you?" Blair reassured them. "Listen to me, boys. Keep your distance from him, especially when he proposes a wager. If he approaches you again, be sure to inform me." With that, Mr. Weasley departed. George and Fred chose not to dwell on the matter of Bagman's deceitful overtures, yet he persisted in seeking them out. "Have you made your decision? If you win, the reward will be substantial. I suggest you wager all your money," Bagman enticed. Before George and Fred could respond, he turned his attention to Blair, continuing, "Do you have any money? If so, you might want to try your luck as well." Insults hovered on the tips of George and Fred's tongues, but Blair could only laugh in disbelief at his audacity. "Dad, Uncle Arthur," the trio shouted in unison, recalling Mr. Weasley's earlier admonitions. Mr. Weasley, who had been conversing with Lee Jordan's father, immediately rushed towards them upon spotting Bagman. Bagman fled, panic-stricken. "Oh, this fellow is truly relentless," Mr. Weasley remarked. Lee's father inquired about the commotion. "What's the matter?" "I placed a bet with him yesterday," Mr. Weasley replied. "Oh, my friend, we ought to retrieve your money at once. He is a fraud. He has no funds to return to you if he loses." With that, Mr. Weasley and Lee's father set off in pursuit of Bagman. That evening, during the final, Mr. Weasley returned with good news. Bagman had repaid the money. Ireland. Ireland. Green-clad figures glided from the stands to the center of the field. Crumb. Their opponents, the Bulgarian team, soon appeared. Even though Crumb captured the golden snitch, the Irish team claimed victory by a margin of 10 points. George and Fred jubilantly cheered for Ireland, then pulled Blair into a spirited dance as excitement enveloped the atmosphere, their exuberance growing. "Oh, watch out. George, don't leap any further. Merlin, Fred, don't climb the railing," Blair shouted, grabbing George, then rushing to deter Fred from scaling the barrier. Once back on solid ground, George and Fred exchanged glances and hoisted Blair into the air. Blair covered her face in embarrassment, feeling utterly mortified. After being set down, she continued to shield her face until George and Fred had lavished her hands with kisses. However, they did not cease their playful antics, proceeding to plant kisses on her cheeks. Blair felt as if her face was entirely adorned with green face paint. Upon returning to the tent, everyone remained abuzz with excitement over the match. George and Fred waved the Irish flag, while Ron proclaimed his adoration for Crumb. "You've fallen for him, Ron," Ginny teased, tugging at the flag in Ron's grasp. "Shut up," Ron retorted. George, noticing Blair's face smeared with green paint, draped the Irish flag over her head. "A green veil?" Ron hesitantly remarked. Ginny led the way, humming the wedding march, and after a moment's hesitation, Blair pulled the flag down to cover her face. "This day is utterly mortifying," she thought, closing her eyes. George and Fred halted the wedding march, whisking Blair outside. Once they stepped out of the tent, Blair pinched George's face, demanding, "Tell me what you think, George. Does it match the paint on your face?" George replied, "It suits you quite well," before smearing a bit more paint on Blair's face. Fred joined in, and soon all three had become a motley crew of painted faces. While meandering through the nearby woods, they unexpectedly encountered Ludo Bagman, surrounded by a throng of goblins who stripped him of all his money. "Had we placed a bet, our funds would have been among those taken," Fred murmured. "Merlin, that's a nightmare," George added. Blair patted the two, saying, "But thankfully, you didn't give him anything." After witnessing the spectacle in the woods, the trio made their way back. "Where have you three been? You missed something significant," Ron called out from the tent. What was it? George and Fred inquired in unison. There were numerous Aurors, and even Professor Dumbledore showed up. They apprehended many Death Eaters, Ron explained. Do you know it was Death Eaters? Blair asked as they entered the tent. Ron, your guess was spot on, she mused internally. Dad mentioned he saw Barty Crouch Jr. He a Death Eater, so I suspect those were indeed Death Eaters who were caught before they could wreak havoc, Ron continued, sharing his analysis. Ginny, Hermione, and Harry supplemented with details they had observed. Wow, this evening has been truly remarkable, Ron exclaimed, followed by Fred's enthusiastic agreement. George and Blair nodded in concurrence with Fred's sentiments. Sirius had also arrived, and it turned out that this was the important matter he had mentioned. Harry remarked that he had felt disheartened when Sirius had said he couldn't join him for the match due to pressing concerns. This year's Quidditch World Cup was exceptionally thrilling. As the holidays progressed, Blair overheard countless remarks from George and Fred regarding Ron's infatuation. Ron had become utterly enamored with Crumb, even declaring him to be his idol. Fred and George chimed in together, speaking to a two-way mirror. I believe Ron will soon encounter his idol, Blair stated. Are you serious, Blair? Fred asked, visibly puzzled. Blair, you must remember that school is starting soon, George pointedly reminded. I wager Ron will meet Crumb shortly, Blair raised an eyebrow. After exchanging glances, George and Fred replied. We bet he won't. What shall the punishment be for the loser? Blair inquired. If you lose, Fred hadn't yet devised a punishment for Blair. How about the hair extension spell to make your hair longer? George interjected, echoing Fred's thoughts. Upon hearing this, Blair questioned, is that truly a punishment? It sounds more like a wish, our shared desire to see Blair with braids. George retorted. Fred nodded in agreement with George, adding, previously. You mentioned that if it grew long enough, you'd braid it. Natural growth is too slow. No problem. If you win, I shall indeed braid my hair, Blair acquiesced. Blair then posed the question, and if you lose, what then? Do you recall the dark cuisine George and I concocted? Fred looked at Blair. After a moment's reflection, Blair responded, you mean that culinary masterpiece you've preserved as a memento? Exactly. If we lose, we shall consume that. George affirmed. Good luck then. I hope your creation doesn't poison you, Blair remarked, observing the two with expressions of utmost confidence. When Dumbledore announced the Triwizard Tournament would be held this year, George and Fred were filled with foreboding. Merlin, may it not be as I fear, George whispered. Fred muttered no under his breath. As the Beauxbatons girls made their entrance, George and Fred felt their anxieties somewhat alleviated. However, when Ron shouted, it's Crumb, they realized they had perhaps relaxed too soon. Fred and George wished to cover Ron's eyes. If we cover Ron's eyes now, can we avoid being counted as losers? George whispered to Blair. Blair chuckled and whispered the most cruel words for George, and Fred, seeing Crumb approach, smacked his forehead and leaned against Blair's shoulder. Can we pretend nothing happened? He murmured. From Blair's smile, Fred understood her response was no. The punishment was your own idea, Blair reminded them, patting their shoulders. When Mr. Crouch declared that students under 17 were prohibited from participating in the tournament, a cacophony of protests erupted from the four house tables. Ultimately, Dumbledore's voice quelled the uproar. Back in their dormitory, the three sat on a bed. George and Fred gazing at the dark dish they had created, swallowing hard. You two made this. Everything in it is safe, so eat it without worry, Blair reassured them. Having sat for so long, it might have spoiled. George looked up at Blair. Fred nodded vigorously, agreeing with George's concern. Didn't you both say you cast a spell to make it edible? Blair retorted. In the end, they tearfully consumed their dark culinary creation. Why the tears? Because it was sour. The expressions on George and Fred's faces contorted in agony. George leaned against Blair's shoulder, and she gently wiped the tears from the corners of his eyes. Fred wrapped his arms around Blair, rubbing against his shirt, prompting her to pet his head. When Lee entered the dormitory, he was met with a peculiar sight. Blair sitting cross-legged on the bed, George with tears in his eyes leaning on her shoulder, and Fred nuzzling against her arm. In the silence, the trio turned their gaze towards him. Lee instantly stiffened. I'll just step outside, he stammered. Blair, observing his demeanor, knew he was concocting wild stories in his mind. After the trio explained, Lee's expression was one of utter disbelief. Would you care to try? They asked in unison. Curiosity trumped all. Lee's scream echoed throughout the dormitory. 2 streams of tears cascaded down his cheeks. In an instant, his face shifted from panic to an eerie calm, and he promptly climbed onto his bed. You didn't react like this, Blair softly remarked. If I had screamed, it would have been utterly embarrassing. George and Fred chimed in unison. Crying on me, is that truly dignified? Blair questioned, perplexed. George and Fred spoke with righteous indignation, their essay distinction. With the duo's puzzled expressions fixed on her, Blair drew her wand and pointed it at herself. As the wand ceased its movement, Blair's short hair transformed into flowing locks. She touched her hair and inquired, I didn't overdo it, did I? Is it too long? The previously sour expressions of George and Fred brightened with excitement at the realization of their wish fulfilled. "Are you ready to be a hairstylist, Fred?" "I certainly am," George asked. "Ready as ever, George," Fred replied confidently. "Stop. It is already night," Blair cautioned the eager duo. "It's fine. Blair, let us practice," George said, already reaching for Blair's hair. "We can style it again tonight and in the morning," Fred declared, having produced a hair tie from who knows where. The following morning, at the long table, Blair's new hairstyle garnered unanimous praise. Her golden locks were half-tied at the back, and the little braids swayed with her movements. The remaining hair cascaded freely, while George and Fred thoughtfully left some strands at her forehead to serve as bangs. This hairstyle lent Blair a vivacious appearance. "So, you two did this?" Ron asked incredulously. Under Ron's watchful gaze, George and Fred proudly nodded. "Wow, I had no idea you possessed such skill," Ginny remarked. Throughout the day, whenever someone complimented Blair's hairstyle, George and Fred would proudly declare it was their handiwork. Chapter 100, Valentine's Day Extra, The Shrinking Potion. The shrinking potion is a concoction that allows one to diminish in size and regain youthfulness. Recently, George and Fred have been diligently researching ways to incorporate this potion into their product line. The most straightforward method to ascertain its efficacy is through personal experimentation. However, success does not come easily, and after 2 consecutive failures, George and Fred approached their third trial with diminished optimism. This time, it was Blair's turn to partake in the experiment. Upon ingestion, he initially exhibited no reaction. Observing the time, Blair turned to George and Fred, whose expressions were tinged with disappointment, and suggested, "Let us take a break in the Wish Grantier's room today." After reclining upon the bed, George and Fred nestled beside Blair. Seeking solace from him, Blair patted their arms and reassured them, "Next time will surely be a success. After all, failure is the mother of success." As time passed, the 3 friends gradually succumbed to slumber, their hands intertwined. The following morning, a suffocating sensation jolted Blair awake. He felt as though a thick cloth enveloped his face, and his hands were firmly grasped. Driven by the instinct for survival, Blair kicked his legs desperately, but his hands remained ensnared. He attempted to speak, yet the heavy fabric clung to his mouth, rendering him capable only of muffled sounds. George and Fred were stirred by the commotion, and as they glanced towards Blair's position, they found it empty. However, they distinctly felt the grip of his hand. Something felt amiss. In unison, they exerted force to lift whatever was concealed beneath the covers. The moment it was exposed to the air, Blair felt as if he had been reborn. The juxtaposition of temperatures sent chills through his shoulders and back. Upon touching his skin, he realized it was exposed to the cool air. Before Blair could fully comprehend the situation, he noticed his hands and voice were also out of sorts. The sounds of inhalation caught his attention. He looked up to see only a blur of red, and upon tilting his head, he recognized 2 familiar faces. George pressed his face close to Blair's, brushing against his remarkably soft cheek. The voice of young George echoed in Blair's ears. "Did yesterday's experiment succeed?" Blair turned to George, inquiring, and then gazed upward at Fred. Fred, observing the loose-fitting pajamas draping Blair, wrapped the blanket around him, leaving only his head exposed, with a few golden strands of hair peeking out. As Fred poked Blair's cheek, he responded to the question. It seems it merely required some time. Annoyed by the prodding, Blair opened his mouth, preparing to bite Fred's outstretched finger, but Fred dodged just in time, while George seized the opportunity to pinch Blair's pouting lips. Laughter echoed throughout the Wish Grantier's room as Blair, now quite diminutive, retaliated with gentle headbutts to both of them. Suddenly, he felt himself lifted off the ground as Fred scooped him up from the bed. George followed closely behind, clutching an extra portion of the blanket, and together they approached a mirror. "Blair, how old do you think you are now?" Fred inquired, gazing into the reflection. After a moment of contemplation, Blair replied, "It's somewhat difficult to discern." "Blair, you were absolutely adorable as a child," both George and Fred chimed in unison. Admiring the sight before them, with his golden hair, brown eyes, and fair complexion, Blair resembled a quintessential doll. George cast a spell to ensure that the school uniform fit Blair snugly. "Are you certain that my current appearance won't cause any issues within the castle?" Blair asked while perched on Fred's arm. "There shouldn't be any major problems," Fred reassured him, gently touseling Blair's tousled hair. "If we truly succeeded, you can revert back tomorrow," George added, echoing Fred's sentiments. In the hallowed halls of Hogwarts, a child of merely a few years appeared, and the trio's entrance was met with great excitement. Shortly thereafter, they were summoned to the headmaster's office. Upon hearing their account, Professor Dumbledore remarked, "What a fascinating experiment. Now, go forth and enjoy your time." Blair noticed Dumbledore winking at him, a twinkle in his eye that spoke of playful mischief. "Merlin, where did this child come from?" Ron inquired upon encountering the trio's return. Fred held Blair up for Ron to see. "Do you not find him familiar? He bears a striking resemblance to Blair," Ron's expression shifted to one of confusion. "What are you thinking?" George playfully tapped Ron on the head. "This is the shrunken version of Blair," Fred clarified. Finally, Blair spoke up, recounting the events leading to his current state as Ron gazed at him in astonishment. "I thought Ron had gone silent mid-sentence," Blair noted, as his eyes conveyed an expression that suggested he might bite. That day, Blair hardly walked at all, as Fred carried him after George had his turn. Given his tiny legs, keeping up with the two was simply impossible. Sitting on their arms, he saw the world from a different perspective, one that was significantly elevated. It would have been preferable if George and Fred had chosen to abandon him, thus avoiding the risks associated with such precarious maneuvers. At first, the sensation of free fall caused Blair to feel a twinge of panic, but eventually, he surrendered to the joy of the experience. Who invented this game? It's such fun, Blair thought to himself, spreading his arms wide during the descent. Who said it wasn't enjoyable? George asked as he caught the falling Blair. Blair planted a kiss on his cheek and feigned amnesia. Who knows? It certainly wasn't me, he chuckled. That evening, as the two cradled Blair, they mused about how he would return to his original form the following morning. Suddenly, Blair's face was subjected to playful torment as they poked and prodded him. "Once I revert, I shall certainly bite Ginny on the waist while she sleeps. I must ensure you two receive the potion." Blair's speech became somewhat incoherent amidst the playful chaos. "No problem at all, Blair," George said, continuing to poke at his cheek. "You can consume as much as you like." Fred chimed in, flicking Blair's other cheek. Ultimately, Blair surrendered to their antics, contemplating how he would retaliate once they too were shrunk. Chapter 101, The Age Dilemma. Only students aged 17 and above are permitted to participate, which strikes me as exceedingly unfair. Blair had lost count of how many times he had heard this sentiment. George and Fred had voiced it, as had Ron and Lee before him, while Ron and Lee resigned themselves to the situation. George and Fred busied themselves concocting an aging potion. Within the Wish Grantier's room, George and Fred diligently stirred the cauldron's contents. "Blair, do you not wish to join?" they inquired, one after the other. "I have no desire to participate, and perhaps you have forgotten something important?" Blair leaned back against the sofa, gazing at the two. "What is it?" they asked in unison. Blair placed his hand on his forehead and replied, "You may not have reached the appropriate age, but I certainly have. Should I wish to participate, there would be no need for age enhancement potions." It was at that moment that George and Fred realized that Blair was older than both of them. Ignoring their expressions, Blair continued, "Thus, I must be a year your senior." Blair's birthday fell on Christmas Day, December 25th. Any young wizard born after September 1st would defer their enrollment by a year. Blair stepped away from the sofa, moving behind the two, and playfully ruffled their hair, remarking, "If you two do not stir the pot, it will surely explode." George and Fred snapped back to reality, noticing the cauldron nearing a violent boil, and began to act frantically, exclaiming Merlin. As the deadline loomed, George and Fred, with the completed age potions in hand, dragged Blair over to the Goblet of Fire. They shared their plan with the onlookers, and Hermione, casting a fleeting glance, turned away, stating, "It won't work." With the age potions in their grasp, George and Fred engaged Hermione in a debate. "Leave a bit for me, if it truly works." "I too would like to use this method to participate," Ron remarked, observing George and Fred's preparations. Grasping Blair with one hand, they simultaneously poured the entirety of the potion into their mouths. "Oh, save a little for me," Ron exclaimed as he watched their actions. Blair was tugged along into the age line drawn by Dumbledore. Once inside, Blair tightened his grip on George and Fred's hands, bracing himself for the inevitable expulsion. Upon realizing they had successfully entered, George and Fred, brimming with excitement, embraced Blair. However, in that very moment, flames erupted from the Goblet of Fire, sending all three tumbling away. "Ah!" they cried in unison. As Blair rose from the ground, he beheld George and Fred transformed, their hair and beards now white. Laughter erupted around them, and as Blair attempted to intervene, he noticed the two were on the verge of a brawl. The surrounding laughter morphed into chants of fight. Fight! With one hand, Blair held off one of them, creating some distance between the two. The instant Blair stood between them, George and Fred ceased their skirmish, simultaneously covering their faces. Unable to suppress a chuckle, Blair burst into laughter. George and Fred tightened their grips on their faces, and Blair gently pushed them back toward the dormitory. Lee remained at the Goblet of Fire, engrossed in the spectacle, leaving only the three of them in the dormitory. "Lower your hands," Blair instructed, attempting to pry away their hands from their faces. The expressions on their faces were utterly despondent. With a playful tug, Blair remarked, "Your eyebrows are entirely white." "It must look dreadful," George said, glancing at Blair. "Not just dreadful," Fred interjected, casting a glance at George. Noticing Fred's gaze, George shouted, "You look the oldest," and reached out to tug at Fred's beard. Fred retaliated by grabbing George's white hair, exclaiming, "You look the most ridiculous." Once more, They launched into verbal and physical jests. Exasperated, Blair fell silent and then seized both of their hair. Taking a seat on the bed, he brought George and Fred to the edge. George, taking the opportunity, embraced Blair and settled on the bed's edge, leaning against Blair's shoulder, his long white beard brushing against Blair's face. The ticklish sensation elicited a giggle from Blair, prompting George to quickly lift his head from Blair's shoulder. "That is mockery," George stated. Blair intended to deny it, but at that moment, Fred leaned in as well. His beard tickled Blair's neck, and the unuttered no was drowned in laughter. "That is mockery," Fred responded to George's claim. Resigned to their fate, Blair began to examine the two's white beards. "When will we revert?" Fred inquired, gazing out the window as if seeking an answer from Merlin. "I hope we return to normal soon," George said, his tone almost wistful. After George's comment, Blair hopped off the bed, searching for something. "What are you looking for, Blair?" George asked, puzzled. Fred also turned to look at Blair, who triumphantly held up a camera. To capture this moment for posterity, Blair reassured them repeatedly that their current appearance was not unappealing and that opportunities like this were rare. Reluctantly, George and Fred acquiesced to Blair's request for a photograph. As Blair observed their long beards, a mischievous idea struck him. He pretended to adjust their clothing, while secretly tying the ends of their beards together. "All right," Blair declared after taking the photo. When George and Fred attempted to walk to Blair's side to view the picture, they felt an unexpected resistance. Looking down, they discovered their beards were entangled. As confusion set in, Blair snapped another photo. "Perfect," he exclaimed. "Not at all," George and Fred replied in unison. As they spoke, they transformed back to their original selves. "Fortunately, I captured it in time. I nearly missed it," Blair stated. Observing the two as they reverted, George and Fred exchanged glances, finally realizing they had returned to normal. "Oh Merlin, thank goodness. Hooray, this is simply marvelous," they exclaimed, each expressing their delight. After viewing the photograph Blair had taken, George and Fred became curious about what Blair would look like as an older version of himself. Blair fell silent under their scrutiny. "I feel as though I might be persecuted," he thought, gazing into their eyes. "Don't get your hopes up. That's a long way off," Blair said, patting their faces. Chapter 102, A Series of Events. On Thursday evening, a multitude of students gathered around the Goblet of Fire, eager to discover which champions would represent their respective houses in the competition. The flames shifted from blue to red, and the first parchment, bearing a name, soared forth. "Victor Krum," Dumbledore announced with a commanding voice. The students from Durmstrang erupted in jubilant congratulations. Next came Fleur Delacour from Beauxbatons, greeted by applause from her fellow students. The Hogwarts champion was undoubtedly Cedric Diggory, amidst a chorus of cheers and whistles. With the results unveiled, life returned to normal for everyone else, resuming its usual course. The position of defense against the dark arts professor also changed hands once more, introducing Alastair Moody, an exceptional orer, as Professor Moody remarked on the students' lack of practical experience. Large question marks appeared on the faces of the students. The sixth-year curriculum primarily focused on the silencing charm and the shield charm. Ignoring the definition of spells, Professor Moody dove straight into practical training. In pairs, one student would cast spells silently while the other defended with the shield charm. "Has defense against the dark arts turned into a dueling arena?" George whispered. "Isn't it more intriguing?" Fred countered. After a moment of contemplation, both George and Blair nodded in agreement. Taking advantage of Professor Moody's inability to distinguish between them, Fred and George took turns practicing with Blair throughout the class. Blair felt as though he were on the brink of asphyxiation before he finally released a silent, disarming spell. Ultimately, it rebounded off Fred's shield charm, sending Blair hurtling through the air. "Oh, Blair!" Fred exclaimed loudly, hastening to his side. George, who had been practicing with Lee, momentarily forgot his own spell upon witnessing Blair's ejection. With Lee's startled shout, George too was flung out. The classroom echoed with a cacophony of shouts. After a brief sparring session, Blair realized he was somewhat intolerant of defeat. As he cast his spell, his mind had been racing with thoughts of "I shall not yield." "This lesson is truly detrimental to camaraderie," Blair remarked upon exiting the classroom. Just a step behind, Fred and George exchanged glances before flanking Blair on either side. "Not at all," they declared in unison, grasping Blair's hands. After giving the two a sidelong glance, Blair conceded. "All right, I admit I find it hard to lose. That is precisely the purpose of practical group exercises. It is through such experiences that one attains progress," George and Fred chimed in. Unfortunately, this practical lesson had been abruptly halted not long ago, with Madame Pomfrey complaining about the excessive noise in the infirmary, while other professors lamented the increase in students' aggressive behavior. Consequently, the points for each house had noticeably declined. "Ah, such delightful days have vanished so swiftly," Fred remarked upon hearing Dumbledore's announcement. "If this continues, the infirmary might just explode," Blair added, echoing Fred's sentiment. The last time I visited the infirmary, Madame Pomfrey looked as if she were ready to duel Professor Moody. George interjected. Blair recalled Madame Pomfrey's expression, laughing so hard that she nearly toppled over. Fred and George each extended a hand to pull him back. One event seemed to lead into another, as Rita Skeeter's news became the latest sensation at Hogwarts. This is utter nonsense. Harry and Ron's voices rose from the long table. Without Harry's involvement, Rita insinuated in her article that Hermione was toying with Crum's affections and attempting to orchestrate his deliberate defeat in the competition. Incensed, Hermione slammed the newspaper onto the table. Blair discreetly conveyed to Hermione via a note that Rita Skeeter was an unregistered animagus. "Wow, how did you come by this information?" George inquired, observing Blair as he scribbled. Blair replied while writing, "Perhaps it's due to my proficiency in divination." "That excuse is rather flimsy," Fred retorted. Blair turned to Fred and asked, "Do you believe it?" "Indeed," Fred nodded. Blair then faced George, receiving the same affirmation. "Very well, then. There shall surely be some entertainment ahead," Blair declared upon completing his note. In just a few days, the trio observed a beetle encased in a jar materializing beside Hermione. Fred knowingly questioned Ron, who cautiously explained the situation to the three. He even shook the jar a few times, revealing that the beetle appeared to have fainted. "She is determined to write another article proving Hermione is not that kind of person," Harry remarked, eyeing the unconscious beetle within the jar. "As an unregistered animagus, you risk fines and imprisonment," Blair noted, scrutinizing the beetle. Its demeanor was evidently more agitated than before. "Perhaps the Daily Prophet might even offer you a bonus. After all, there is a dearth of accurate reporting on the realities of Azkaban," Hermione added. "You could also become our test subject," George and Fred remarked in unison, gazing at the beetle in the jar. On the side, Ron and Harry exhibited eager anticipation. For Rita Skeeter, intimidation and threats evidently proved more effective than corporal punishment. The speed of this article's publication attested to her profound fear of losing her reputation. George and Fred observed the new article published in the Daily Prophet. After Blair echoed a few comments, he realized the conversation had veered off course and transformed into a discussion on how to become an animagus. For an entire month, one must continuously hold a single leaf of mandrake in their mouth, Blair stated while perusing a book. His words were automatically translated in George and Fred's minds to "can't kiss for a month." There are plenty of intriguing matters to discuss. "Perhaps we ought to change the subject," George and Fred harmonized, promptly closing the book in Blair's hands. As Fred and George observed Blair's speechless expression, they demonstrated through their actions that it was indeed unfeasible. Seizing a moment to breathe, Blair swiftly exclaimed, "Stop. I understand now, no need to prove it." Yet all he received in return was suffocation. The topic of animagus had been effectively crossed off the trio's task list. Chapter 103, Preparations for the Ball. On November 14th, the first event of the Triwizard Tournament commenced in earnest. When the Welsh Green Dragon appeared in the arena, the previously boisterous crowd fell into an immediate hush. The trio, who had been calling for bets, including Blair, George, and Fred, halted their motions and fixated on the imposing creature before them. "Wow, this is absolutely incredible," Fred exclaimed, clutching the betting box. "I never anticipated the first event would be this thrilling," George added. Blair applauded, noticing that their attention was entirely captivated by the dragon. Their focus quickly shifted back to Blair. "Whom will you two be betting on?" "Cedric," George and Fred answered in unison. Blair, affirming, declared, "I was thinking the same," and placed his bet on Cedric. At that moment, Ron and Harry rushed over to place their wagers, both also betting on Cedric. "Harry, are you really going to wager that much?" George asked, eyeing the substantial sum Harry had brought. "Most of it belongs to Sirius. He believes victory is destined for Hogwarts." Harry replied, "I concur with that sentiment." "We do too," the trio echoed in agreement. Cedric was the last to enter the fray, and his performance earned all those who had bet on him a handsome profit. After the first event concluded, Cedric acquired the moniker Hermes. "Who is this Plutus?" Fred inquired, glancing at Blair as he calculated. "We heard someone refer to Cedric by that name earlier," George added. "In Greek mythology, he is the god of wealth, among other things." "Are you saying someone called Cedric the god of fortune?" As Blair pieced it together, he could no longer suppress his laughter. It seemed Cedric himself was equally perplexed by the name. Reflecting on the scene, Fred chuckled. George moved behind Blair, wrapping his arms around his neck as he peered at the ledger, then remarked, "Perhaps that title suits him rather well." After handing the ledger to Fred, Blair soon heard him exclaim, "Well, it certainly fits, exceeding all our expectations. You may acquire new attire for the ball." Blair playfully bumped heads with George before lifting her gaze towards Fred. Leaning in close, Fred whispered beside her, "A gown that perfectly complements yours." "It's evident that they are a matched pair," George chimed in, upon seeing the dress Mrs. Weasley sent to Ron. "We felt immensely fortunate to have expressed our lack of need for it in advance." "Ginny, this must be for you," Ron declared as he approached Ginny with the dress in hand. Ginny's expression was one of sheer resistance, as if to say, I would never wear that. It's utterly hideous. Their banter elicited hearty laughter from Hermione, Harry, and the three other onlookers. Isn't your package filled with such robes? Ron inquired, glancing at the parcels before Fred and George. Certainly not. They replied in unison, promptly showcasing their own elegant garments. The gowns were a deep blue hue, crafted from sumptuous velvet, their colors shifting with the angle of the light. Oh, this is so unfair, Ron lamented, holding up the robe he had. That's quite fair, George and Fred retorted simultaneously. Blair's gown was a khaki shade, harmonizing beautifully with the deep blue of the others, presenting a striking yet cohesive contrast. To uphold Gryffindor's reputation, Professor McGonagall resolved to teach everyone how to dance proficiently. The trio was rather indifferent, as they had already decided to perform a trio dance, rendering McGonagall's expertise somewhat irrelevant. Blair leaned against the wall at the back, while George and Fred rested their shoulders against hers. Mr. Weasley, would you care to join me for a dance? Professor McGonagall's words jolted the trio, who had been on the verge of dozing off. Now this is getting interesting, Fred remarked, eyeing Ron, who was being pulled onto the stage by McGonagall. George added that he hoped she would allow for a few missteps. Just as Blair was about to respond to the two, McGonagall's gaze fell upon them. To avoid becoming the next demonstration subjects, they quickly silenced themselves. You'll have plenty of opportunities to mock him for a lifetime, Harry quipped to George and Fred. Indeed, they replied. Soon, the other students joined in, and the trio's conspicuous presence caught McGonagall's attention. You always come up with such marvelous ideas. Quite a creative endeavor, she remarked as she observed their dance steps. Those students struggling with awkwardness began to take note of the unfolding scene. It can be played this way too. It was as if they had stumbled upon a new frontier, and soon, numerous similar pairs appeared on the dance floor. After releasing Ron, he and Harry approached Hermione to extend an invitation to form a trio. Hermione's eyes conveyed her answer, a firm rejection. Now you can be mocked for a lifetime, Fred said, casting a glance at the unsuccessful duo. Meanwhile, George and Blair demonstrated how to ridicule effectively. For a time, a singular question plagued the majority of Hogwarts. How does one successfully invite their crush to be their partner? Lee was also troubled by this dilemma and decided to consult his roommates. Take the initiative. Just tell her directly, came the prompt response. Be forthright. It's very straightforward. After hearing their suggestions, Lee felt even more despondent. Didn't you consider what if it doesn't work out? He asked the trio. At least there's a chance. Isn't there? Blair retorted. If you don't say anything, the probability is 0, George and Fred chimed in, each offering their input. Oh, I shouldn't have discussed this with you. You simply cannot comprehend my plight, Lee said, exiting the dormitory. Where could he possibly go? Blair pondered aloud. He's off to seek someone who understands him, George replied, draping an arm around Blair's shoulder. Clearly, our approach is the most effective method, Fred added, resting his arm on Blair's other shoulder. Ultimately, Lee chose to adopt the strategies suggested by the trio, but due to his hesitation, his crush had already found someone else. I swear by Merlin, I shall prioritize your ideas first next time, he lamented while lying on his bed. After exchanging glances, the trio stepped forward to pat him on the shoulder. Chapter 104. The dance continues in Gryffindor's common room. Blair and her companions observed a despondent Harry. Whom did you invite? Fred inquired curiously. Harry, reclining on the sofa, replied, Cho Chang from Ravenclaw. George responded with surprise, receiving an affirmative nod from Harry. The trio exchanged glances, contemplating how to console him, just as Ron entered the common room, supported by Ginny and surrounded by a curious crowd. What happened? Harry asked, puzzled. Ron appeared to be more shaken than Harry. Ginny briefly recounted Ron's recent exploits. I can see it now. You truly are a Gryffindor, remarkably courageous, George and Fred teased, wrapping their arms around Blair as they regarded the dazed Ron. Blair glanced at Harry and Ron and remarked, You two are truly the best of friends. Ron looked bewildered, while Harry awkwardly scratched his head, dressed in a khaki gown with her golden hair elegantly styled to reveal her earrings. Blair caught a glimpse of George and Fred's reflections while gazing into a mirror. Mirror, mirror, tell me, how do I look in this ensemble? She inquired. You look absolutely perfect, they replied in unison, stepping beside her. Blair playfully tugged at the bow ties around their necks and said, You two look splendid as well. Following her lead, George and Fred leaned in and bestowed a quick kiss on her cheek. Just then, Blair felt her hand being grasped, and she inquired, What is going on? Before she could finish her question, her eyes were covered, and she sensed the two were playfully tugging at her sleeves. Tap, 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 George and Fred exclaimed, unveiling her eyes and lifting her hand to reveal 2 cufflinks adorning her sleeves, crafted from mother of pearl. We thought they would pair beautifully with your gown. Do you like them, Blair? They asked, each taking turns. Blair echoed their earlier sentiments, responding, They look absolutely perfect. After saying this, she once again fastened their bow ties. Close your eyes. Upon hearing this, George and Fred obediently complied. When they opened their eyes again, their bow ties had been swapped for a different style. Blair then took their hands and led them out of the dormitory. On their way to the Great Hall, they encountered Harry and Ron. No one has invited her at all. Oh, it appears that our dear brother hasn't visited the library in quite some time, George and Fred chimed in unison. What does that have to do with me going to the library? Ron queried, glancing at the trio. Your dance partner is someone you once harbored feelings for. Blair hinted at Ron, directing his gaze towards him. To address their experimental challenges, the three had recently taken to the library. The level of congestion in the library was unlike anything they had ever encountered. I think I know why, George remarked, eyeing Crumb. Fred interjected. Ah, that explains it. Their unexpected encounter with an invitation was unforeseen. Although the library was less crowded, the key figures were all present. I wonder how Ron will react once he learns. Fred mused. We should keep an eye on him, Blair proposed. It is bound to be quite entertaining, George added. Someone you once had a crush on? What does that mean? Ron's question startled the trio from their reverie. You'll find out in due time, Blair replied, feigning mystery. George and Fred nodded in agreement. Shortly thereafter, the three departed, leaving Ron, deep in thought, and a somewhat puzzled Harry behind. As they welcomed the champions, Blair and the others positioned themselves beside Ron. After all, opportunities for such close observation were rare. Following the champions' opening dance, a multitude of spectators filled the venue. Blair, taking George and Fred by the hand, led them into the hall. To the rhythm of the music, the trio executed various dance steps. The tempo's fluctuations scarcely affected Blair's movements. Yet George and Fred struggled to keep their legs from tangling during the faster beats. Observing the two, who could hardly walk after their dance, Blair guided them to a seat. I feel as though these legs no longer belong to me. Fred leaned against the table and remarked. I nearly tripped over myself. George echoed, reflecting on the earlier events. Blair, evidently amused, trembled with laughter, causing the table behind them to shake. In the next moment, Blair sensed something tumble onto his lap. Glancing down, he found a small cake resting there, bewildered. Turning to the table behind him, he queried, was I shaking that much? Did the cake really fly over here? His expression of confusion elicited laughter from George and Fred. Oh, Blair, what were you thinking? Take a closer look, they teased. Upon inspecting the cake more closely, Blair suddenly comprehended. My birthday cake. But why is it presented in this manner? He asked, puzzled. After casting the spell, we instructed Yo-Yo to surprise you, George and Fred explained, each contributing a sentence before declaring in unison, we never anticipated this would be its idea of a surprise. Indeed, it is quite a surprise, Blair mused, contemplating the cake that had seemingly appeared from thin air. As the trio shared the cake, they felt two undeniable gazes upon them. Following the direction, they saw Harry and Ron. Care for a slice? Blair inquired, hesitantly signaling to the two. The pair responded with a similar look of hesitation. Then they turned in unison to observe Hermione, who was dancing with Crumb. After the music ceased, Hermione settled beside them, engaging in conversation that was inaudible to the trio. However, the outcome was evidently not amicable. I bet our dear brother said something, Ron speculated excitedly. I think you're right, Fred concurred, affirming George's guess. On their way back to the dormitory, George and Fred recalled that they had forgotten to wish Blair a happy birthday. Happy birthday, Blair, they exclaimed in unison. Blair playfully tugged at their bow ties and bestowed a kiss upon each of them before saying, Merry Christmas. Chapter 105. The second task. Have you seen Hermione? We haven't spotted her at all, Harry and Ron interrupted the trio, who were deep in discussion at the competition site. The three before them replied with a synchronized shake of their heads. Blair contemplated saying that they would soon find out where Hermione was, but Harry and Ron hurriedly departed. Do you think Hermione's disappearance is related to the competition? George ventured a guess. After all, Crumb is a contestant, Fred added. Blair applauded in admiration and remarked, I think so too. When Dumbledore mentioned that the treasures were hidden beneath the lake, Harry and Ron finally realized that Hermione had been concealed as Crumb's treasure at the lake's bottom. Oh, Merlin, he better bring Hermione back, Ron exclaimed with fervor. Calm down, Ron. Professor Dumbledore wouldn't truly allow any harm to come to Hermione, Harry soothed, holding back the overly excited Ron. Clap. Blair and the others slapped hands together. Our deduction was spot on. Perhaps this is the gift of divination, George and Fred chimed, each taking turns. Cedric's officially certified treasure, Cho Chang. Crumb's officially certified treasure, Hermione. They teased, leaning close to Blair. Oh, poor Harry and Ron, they said in unison. Blair instinctively glanced towards Ron and Harry, both of whose expressions were quite entertaining. With the sound of the cannon, the three champions swiftly plunged into the water. If Cedric comes out on top again, his status as our lucky charm will be further solidified, Fred remarked, leaning against Blair as Cedric submerged. Then he is indeed our lucky charm, Blair thought. Recalling their previous gains, George began to count on his fingers and declared, "Undoubtedly our lucky charm." The surface of the lake appeared unremarkable as ever. "How dull. When will someone resurface? This lake looks too normal," they lamented, leaning against the railing and critiquing the serene waters. Blair yawned, staring at the lake, while a bored Fred covered his mouth with his hand. Following the arm before him, he encountered Fred's smiling face. Annoyed, Blair attempted to snap at him, but Fred quickly withdrew his hand, resulting in Blair inadvertently biting George, who was trying to fend off Fred. An excessively coincidental scene unfolded. Blair glanced again at Fred's arm and saw George's bewildered expression. Quickly releasing his grip, he took George's hand and gave it a gentle rub. While doing so, he sneakily kicked Fred. When idle, one often finds their mind wandering to various thoughts. For instance, George suddenly posed a question. If Lau were a warrior, who would his treasure be? A warrior can only possess one treasure, George added promptly. As he posed the question, Blair felt a sense of impending doom. Fred, meanwhile, turned his gaze towards Blair. Blair fixated on the tranquil surface of the lake, hoping to discern any peculiarities that might allow him to shift the topic of conversation. Perhaps it was genuine sentiment that stirred within him. He mused, "Thank you, Merlin." Indeed, someone emerged from the depths of the lake. "Thank God. Thank you, Merlin," Blair thought to himself. Upon recognizing who it was, he silently added, "Thank you, Cedric." Ultimately, Blair adeptly redirected the discussion towards the results of the competition. The placid waters began to ripple, revealing the identity of the victor. Fleur had withdrawn midway, and shortly after Cedric emerged, Crumb also surfaced from the lake. As Crumb, accompanied by Hermione, ascended to the platform, Harry and Ron rushed to greet them. Both events had Cedric as the winner, and the students of Hogwarts felt certain that the ultimate triumph would belong to their school. The fervor among the Hogwarts students intensified. Meanwhile, students from the other two schools rallied in support of their chosen champions, creating an atmosphere rife with tension among the three institutions. "Was it Crumb who brought you back? We are rivals now. This is treachery," Ron exclaimed from the common room, gazing at Hermione upon her return. "Treachery? Who was enamored with him before?" Hermione retorted. "That was in the past," Ron countered. "Oh, Merlin, who will save me?" Harry thought to himself. Ron and Hermione erupted into yet another argument over Crumb. Caught between them, Harry felt helpless and indecisive. When Blair and the others entered the common room, they were met with this scene. Harry's expression conveyed a silent plea for assistance. "About face. March," Blair and Harry commanded, locking eyes. George and Fred promptly obeyed, retreating from the common room, leaving the battleground to the three inside. "Even Merlin would have to turn away from this spectacle," Blair remarked as they exited. George and Fred reflected on the earlier scene, nodding in agreement with Blair's sentiments. Little did they realize that the flames of conflict would soon reach them as well. "Are you suggesting that you wish to compete with us fairly?" "Compete in what? Why should we compete with you?" George and Fred inquired, eyeing the boastful boy before them. A Durmstrang student had boldly declared his instant infatuation with Blair at the ball, vowing to compete with the twins. "Did you not inquire about the situation before your arrival?" Fred asked, his expression darkening. He quickly received a response. "They said the three of you together meant you two were pursuing him, didn't they?" "You ought to learn some English first," George remarked, shoving past the boy blocking their path. Fred followed suit from the other side, sending the boy spinning. Blair was pulled by Harry to address the conflict between Hermione and Ron. The atmosphere in the common room made Blair feel restless. As the door swung open, George and Fred entered. Blair instantly sprang up from the sofa and hurried to his two saviors. "What on earth is that expression on your faces?" he asked, perplexed upon noticing their demeanor. "Who sent you two?" "Durmstrang is simply a bunch of ruffians." Ron's voice rang out. "Indeed. X2. Before Hermione could retort, George and Fred chimed in. Blair and Hermione exchanged puzzled glances at the two. Ron, having found allies, grew increasingly agitated. "You have nothing left to say to him," Hermione shouted at Ron. Ron stared at Hermione, while George and Fred turned their attention to Blair. At the moment their gazes met, Blair crossed his arms and uncrossed his chest. "It wasn't me," Blair quickly clarified. George and Fred hoisted Blair back to their dormitory. Under Blair's inquiry, George and Fred recounted the recent events. After listening, Blair wrapped his arms around both of them, affectionately patting their backs while saying, "No hard feelings. It's not a big deal." Blair hadn't finished when George and Fred voiced their confusion. "Oh, all right, it's a big deal." Blair resolved to ride the wave of camaraderie. "So in the end, you knocked him about like a top?" Blair asked, recalling their earlier words. "Indeed." George and Fred nodded vigorously. They then recounted how absurd that individual had been. As Blair listened, he chimed in, and after venting, the two's spirits finally lifted. Chapter 106, A Chaotic April Fool's Day. Today is April Fool's Day, and I intend to prank the Durmstrang students. Take me with you. We can use the punching telescope against them. That is a splendid idea. This was already the 8th prank plan Blair had inadvertently overheard that morning. Mind you, he hadn't even had breakfast yet. En route to the Great Hall, he had heard so many plans. It felt as if today's sales would surpass those of previous years. Blair shook George and Fred's hands, saying, "We've got quite the sales lined up." Fred chimed in, "Not only do we have orders from Hogwarts, but we've also received requests from Durmstrang and Beauxbatons." George added, "Oh, it seems this year's April Fool's Day will be utterly chaotic." Upon hearing their words, Blair remarked, "Indeed, it appears today will be quite the spectacle." Throughout the morning, the trio either attended classes or introduced customers to prank products. With rare free time, Blair calculated how many items he had sold that morning. Under the expectant gazes of George and Fred, Blair announced astonishing news. "This morning alone, we've sold as much as we did in the entire last April Fool's Day. Hooray! X2. George and Fred cheered joyfully upon hearing this. "I feel like Hogwarts is going to explode today," Blair mused, contemplating the astonishing sales figures. "That should be quite a sight," Fred added, echoing Blair's sentiment. Blair looked at him in confusion, prompting Fred to stroke his hair and reassure him, "Fear not, Lyle. These are merely minor prank products. They shouldn't cause Hogwarts to explode." George supplemented, "Shouldn't?" "Definitely," George affirmed. "Let us hope so," Blair responded. Now, sporadic screams reverberated through Hogwarts. Bang! While the trio was completing their assignments in the library, the once quiet space erupted into chaos with a loud bang. "Clear waters, restore as before." Madame Pance's incantation echoed through the library, igniting a cacophony of fireworks that set ablaze several books. The library had been devastated. How far could the destruction spread? Blair glanced at the two individuals beside him as he spoke. George immediately exclaimed, "I swear by Merlin, that was the least potent firework. Who could have imagined they would dare to set them off in the library?" Fred added swiftly, "It was not intentional, truly an accident, Madame Pance." The voice of the culprits, pleading for mercy, resonated within the library. "You shall bear the consequences." The fury in Madame Pance's tone was palpable. "I thought you were merely pretending. How could you have actually ignited it?" "I was pretending. It was your fault for jostling my hand just as I was about to demonstrate." As Madame Pance led the culprits out of the library, they began to bicker. "Perhaps we should have made the fuse longer," Fred suggested, listening to the quarrel between George and Blair. George paused for a moment before responding, "Yes," to allow them time for reconsideration. Blair, touched by their concern, applauded them, saying, "You two are truly considerate." As they walked down the corridor, a chattering sound grew louder from above, akin to a flock of birds soaring overhead. A flock of birds? How could there be a flock of birds in the castle? Blair mused, tilting his head upwards. "Canaries, a whole flock of canaries. I recall that a significant quantity of canary biscuits was sold today," Blair remarked, pulling George and Fred away from their spot. "If they all transform back at the same time, those below might be crushed." "Why are there so many canaries in the castle? Are they yours?" An innocent Durmstrang student inquired. "You could stand beneath them. They might take a liking to you." A Hogwarts student, well versed in the effects of canary biscuits, mischievously replied. Watching the naive outsider, a wicked thought crossed his mind. The canaries in the air began to swirl around the unsuspecting student, who soon found himself airborne. "Wow, this is truly magical. I want to take one home." As he spoke, the minute was nearly up. One canary perched upon his shoulder, and in the next moment, the weight of it toppled the Durmstrang student. As he rose, he discovered that the canaries that had been circling him had transformed into humans. "Which one do you wish to take?" A Gryffindor canary posed the question. A circle of canaries turned their gaze toward the boy in the center. Blair leaned against the wall, enjoying the spectacle, while Fred and George stifled their laughter, wary of ruining the performance. The farce concluded with a troop from Durmstrang arriving to rescue the besieged boy. "The fireworks have blown up the library, and the canary swarm has migrated. I can hardly wait to see what happens tonight," Blair exclaimed. Upon finishing, George and Fred pulled him to his feet. "The instant escape suites have sold remarkably well. The infirmary must be brimming with people," they said in unison. "Oh, Merlin, not another one who has fainted. Place him in a chair. There are no beds available." "Support him," Madame Pomfrey called out, surveying the beds filled to capacity. That evening, the three celebrated a birthday in the kitchen, while the scenes outside were recounted to them by Ron the following morning. At that moment, the sounds echoed as nearly 20 individuals were consecutively bitten by the nosy teacups. It sounded almost melodic. Harry reminisced about the scene, adding, "And someone was using dung bombs in the hall. Mind you, dinner was being served at that time." Hermione exclaimed, clearly unable to tolerate the thought. "Oh, that stench made several people retch," Ron recalled, grimacing at the memory of the hall's aroma. "Oh, Merlin, I nearly forgot." Ron's words prompted Harry to recall the previous night's chaos. "Thank goodness we were not there." "Indeed, Merlin bless us," George and Fred echoed in unison. Blair made a gesture of prayer before them. "Oh, those were sold by you," Ron remarked, looking at the trio. Indeed, they were. However, we imposed no restrictions. George and Fred replied, glancing at Blair. When did they use them? Blair completed the final query, and the three exchanged a triumphant clap. Chapter 107, The Final Showdown. The final match of the Triwizard Tournament was scheduled for June 24th. As the date drew closer, the atmosphere in the school became increasingly tense. Cheer on Cedric during the final. Victory belongs to Hogwarts. We all believe in you, Cedric. Cedric received countless similar blessings along his path. Oh, thank you. I will certainly give it my all, Cedric replied adeptly. Ah, our brave champion. With the final battle approaching, what are your thoughts? George and Fred inquired, each taking turns to ask. Blair shaped his hands like a microphone and extended it toward Cedric. Ahem, I will do my best. I won't let you go bankrupt. Cedric responded cooperatively. Bankruptcy is out of the question. You have no idea how much we earned from the first two tasks. Fred and George quickly chimed in. Soon, the day of the final arrived. After embracing Mr. Diggory, Cedric stepped into the maze. Good luck, my boy, Mr. Diggory said, embracing Cedric. See you later, Dad, Cedric replied. Looking back at Mr. Diggory, who appeared immensely proud of him, Harry observed the interaction between the Diggorys and commented. Nearby, Sirius, who had come to watch the final, patted Harry on the shoulder and said, if you were competing, I would be proud of you too. Of course, you are already my pride, Harry. After saying this, Sirius sensed the ambiguity of his words and hastily added clarification. Meanwhile, the trio was engrossed in their business. Cedric Diggory has the best odds, George remarked to a Durmstrang boy eager to place a bet. Despite George's statement, the boys still wagered on Crumb. Everyone was genuinely supporting their own school. After the betting crowd dispersed, Blair noted, after all, no one wants to be overshadowed by another school before the results are in. Fred recalled the expressions of those who had just placed their bets. It's about time. Let us return and rest a while, Blair suggested, pulling George and Fred back to the Hogwarts stands. As time ticked away, tension mounted as everyone fixated on the maze's exit. Cedric must be the first to emerge. Crumb. Bless Fleur. The trio was swept up in the atmosphere, their eyes glued to the exit. When a flash of yellow appeared at the exit, the Hogwarts stands erupted in ecstatic fervor. As Cedric stood firmly in place, a throng of people quickly encircled him. Mr. Diggory parted the crowd and embraced his son. Then, with an arm around Cedric's shoulder, he proclaimed loudly and proudly to those around him, "This is my son, Cedric. Cedric." The surrounding crowd echoed Cedric's name, their voices a chorus of joy and triumph that belonged to Hogwarts. Meanwhile, the students from the other two schools anxiously fixated on the exit. Their initial ambition to be first had transformed into a desperate desire to avoid finishing last. After the competition concluded, Cedric accompanied his father back to the spectators' area, where he exchanged high-fives with Blair and the others as they passed. We just did some calculations, and we think your image as the god of wealth, George and Fred chimed in, will be far more memorable than your image as a champion. Blair added to George's remark, "Ha, well, at least it helps everyone." Cedric smiled in response. Oh, the great Cedric Diggory, the trio in front of him said in unison. Ultimately, Mr. Diggory joyfully led Cedric away. The moment Fleur stepped through the exit, the Triwizard Tournament officially came to a close. To celebrate Cedric's victory, Hogwarts hosted a grand ceremony that evening. Congratulations to Cedric, who has brought honor to Hogwarts, exclaimed Professor Dumbledore, raising his glass. The sound of thunderous applause erupted from the long table below. Cheers for Cedric reverberated in every corner of the hall. Cedric rose to bow, expressing his gratitude for the congratulations he received, radiating joy. The faces of those present lit up, and as the festivities commenced, Cedric became the center of attention, surrounded by admirers seeking photographs and autographs. The conclusion of the tournament signified that the departure of the students from Durmstrang and Beauxbatons was drawing near. As Crumb prepared to leave, he sought out Hermione, accompanied by the Durmstrang student who had fallen for Blair at first sight. Hermione, here you go. You must promise to write to me, Crumb said, gazing at Hermione. Goodbye. After receiving her response, Crumb walked away. Meanwhile, a rather awkward scene unfolded as George and Fred stood behind Blair, staring intently at the Durmstrang boy. I misunderstood before, and now I'm about to leave. I don't want you to remain ignorant of my appearance until the very end. Upon hearing this, George and Fred's teeth began to grind audibly. Does it really matter whether you see him or not? Hurry up and leave. Crumb has already gone. George and Fred thought to themselves, their expressions suggesting they could dismantle the boy before them. After the boy finished speaking, he did not wait for a response before departing, likely aware that he would not receive the desired reply. Blair turned to the two after the boy left and patted their faces. In return, she received 2 human-shaped pendants, wrapping her arms around their waists. Does it really matter whether you see him or not? What difference does knowing what he looks like make? George and Fred's voices echoed in Blair's ears, filled with frustration. It makes no difference. If you keep grinding your teeth, They might actually break, Blair said, soothingly stroking their backs. They won't break. If he says a few more words, we'll go and bite him to death, George and Fred declared, each taking turns. Oh, Merlin, you are wizards, Blair laughed. Then let's unleash the monster book, George said, draping his arms around Blair's neck defiantly. And then bite him to death, Fred added, positioning himself beside Blair. All right, let us return to the dormitory to fetch the book, Blair agreed, leading the two, who were clinging to her, away from the lively scene. Chapter 108, The Start of Entrepreneurship. Look at how well I've drawn, Fred said, pointing at the paper sprawled across the bed. What is this? George frowned, scrutinizing the drawing. Blair, seated cross-legged on the bed, leaned over to inspect the artwork, only to retreat into silence. Fred's creation was decidedly too abstract. Can't you tell? Take a closer look, Fred explained, holding up the drawing. George and Blair supported their faces with their hands, their expressions a complex mix as they regarded Fred's art. Even I couldn't decipher it. Your drawing skills are truly something, brother, George finally remarked, giving Fred a knowing look. I can vaguely discern a human figure, Blair commented on the drawing. This is the first meeting regarding the decor for our future shop. Prior to this, the trio had already convened to discuss the location and had begun taking action. Meeting details, one afternoon during summer vacation, location, Blair's bedroom, participants, Fred, George, Blair. Following this, George and Blair spread their sketches across the bed. How could you two have the audacity to look at my drawing with those expressions? Fred asked sincerely after examining their work. Just a tad better, Blair said defiantly. Fred pressed his hands on Blair's legs, looking at him intently. That point is entirely negligible. Blair nudged his head against Fred. George caught Blair, who had nearly toppled onto Fred. Throughout the afternoon, the three attempted to improve their artistic prowess, but by dinner time, when the Vance couple inquired, none had made significant progress. Some drawings were still mere rough sketches. Professional matters should be entrusted to professionals, Mr. Vance's words prompted the trio to abandon their aspirations of mastering the art of drawing. As summer vacation drew to a close, they finally received a satisfactory draft. Yes, this is precisely what I envisioned, Fred exclaimed regarding the design for the storefront sign. As George and Blair perused the design draft, they reminisced about Fred's initial sketches. After exchanging glances, they recognized the same sentiment in each other's eyes. This is quite a disparity, isn't it? The trio had consulted a Muggle designer, who, upon hearing their ideas, marveled at their innovative concepts. With their imaginations running wild, the designer's creativity soared. Thus, the design for the Weasleys' Wizard Wheezes was born. Are you really not going to include your name, Blair? George and Fred asked in unison at that moment. Blair pondered for a moment. A shop name that includes his own would ensure that with George and Fred's talents, the establishment would gain renown. Blair shook his head vigorously, prompting Fred to halt his rapid head movements for fear of injury. To spare Blair's neck, George and Fred abandoned the idea. However, a sign bearing Blair's name would hang in the section of the shop designated for the trio. Perhaps you'll grow accustomed to it over time, George suggested to Blair. Fred chimed in, and then we can add your name to the shop's title later. Blair feigned agreement on the surface, while internally, she was resolutely opposed. The trio, unable to remain idle upon receiving the design blueprints, found themselves escorted to a modest abode. As George and Fred emerged from the fireplace, one grasped Mrs. Weasley, while the other tugged at Mr. Weasley. Once the door was shut, the duo launched into a fervent oration. When the Weasley couple expressed skepticism regarding their claims, Blair interjected with corroborative evidence, affirming that the two were not merely boasting, ultimately revealing the design blueprints to the Weasleys. Oh, the design of this entranceway is absolutely splendid, Mr. Weasley remarked, studying the plans. The three introduced various aspects of the shop to the Weasley couple. While they spoke animatedly, Mrs. Weasley posed a pivotal question. So, what exactly do you want us to do? We have already secured a location and require a reliable renovation team. With the school term fast approaching, we lack the time to monitor the progress. George and Fred each voiced their thoughts. As Mrs. Weasley hesitated, Blair mentioned the upcoming nude examinations. Ultimately, to avoid hindering the trio's studies, the Weasley couple acquiesced to their request. Hooray! The three exclaimed in unison. Are you opening a shop? Where? Ron inquired eagerly as they exited the room. Number 93 Diagon Alley. George and Fred replied in chorus. Ron then asked, will there be discounts? Not a grand opening sale, but a family rate. Double. What? Ron shouted incredulously. Blair chuckled at the scene unfolding before her. As the school term commenced, George and Fred's correspondence increased significantly. Mr. Weasley frequently updated the two on the progress, while Mrs. Weasley inquired about their preparations for the nude exams. To reassure their mother, George and Fred included photographs in their replies, which eventually devolved into prefabricated images. Upon discovering this, Mrs. Weasley sent them a howler. The moment they saw the scarlet envelope, George and Fred knew their ruse had been uncovered. Blair silently leaned back, grateful for any escape. Fred Weasley, George Weasley, no more tricks. Otherwise, I'll have them halt construction. Just wait and see. You'll be left with a half-finished building. Ron and Ginny covered their ears as George and Fred recoiled from the Howler's wrath. The Howler followed the two, leaving Blair to evade its fury. Now I truly understand the might of a Howler, Fred remarked, gazing at the dissipating letter. Blair added, I actually didn't want to know that much. The threat of halting construction evidently struck fear into George and Fred, leading to a notable increase in their library visits. Mr. Weasley kindly included photographs of the shop under renovation in his letters. Oh, this is all worth it, Fred exclaimed as he perused the images. Blair and George nodded in agreement. Indeed, once we graduate, our shop will be ready for opening. George reflected upon the photographs. It'll serve as a graduation gift. Blair echoed his sentiment. Chapter 109, The Grand Opening Prelude. Oh, Merlin, this is more arduous than the OWL exams, Fred lamented, his head resting on the table. Under the seemingly murderous gaze of Mrs. Pants, Blair covered his mouth. Meanwhile, George, tormented by knowledge, had lost even the strength to lament. His spirit felt as though it might escape from his slightly parted lips. For the past few days, the only thing sustaining the two was the sporadic photographs sent by Mr. Weasley. George pointed to a particular area in one of the images, stating to Fred and Blair, This section feels off. Let us see if there are any other issues. Fred, taking the photograph, scrutinized it closely. Blair grabbed a piece of parchment and a quill, jotting down the problems depicted in the images. Mr. Weasley, who had anticipated praise in response, instead received a lengthy list of unresolved issues. Such rare attentiveness, Mrs. Weasley remarked as she read the reply. Due to a lack of information, the renovation progress had slowed considerably. Fool seems to have aged recently, Blair noted while feeding the owl. George reached out to touch Fool's feathers and remarked, the texture has changed. As if understanding, Fool pecked at George's hand. So you have nothing better to do than peck me for mentioning the feather's texture? George retorted, evading the peck. It truly feels older, Fred added. But before he could finish, Fool pecked him as well. The disparity is quite significant, Fred exclaimed at Fool, as George and Fred reached out with mischievous intentions. Fool cleverly flew out the window, taking with him the nth compilation of their questions. Fool's departure did not deter George and Fred. Instead, Blair became the new target of their antics. As their eyes met, Blair felt an ominous premonition. Attempting to flee, she was intercepted mid-flight as Fred caught her around the waist. George pecked her on the left cheek, mimicking Fool's earlier action, while Fred did the same on her right. In retrospect, Blair felt that her face was in utter disarray. When Fool returned, George and Fred occasionally repeated these antics, inciting Fool's curiosity and prompting him to attempt the same, leading to a chaotic scene. Fool dove at Blair, who dodged, while George and Fred provided cover. Just when they thought Fool had given up, Blair encountered a sudden assault from the owl. With the continuous arrival of photographs, the list of issues was steadily addressed. The shop began to take shape, and George and Fred started contemplating how to promote it to attract customers. While preparing for their nude exams, they also conducted market research. This strategy had been devised by Cedric, aiming to surprise Autumn. Having never visited the Weasley shop, he made his first purchase. Great idea, Cedric. George and Fred chimed in unison. Blair added, New customer, let me give you a discount for this order. George and Fred nodded in agreement with Blair's statement. Oh, I will surely become a loyal customer in the future, Cedric declared to the trio. After all, one surprise is never enough, George and Fred teased. Observing Cedric accept this notion, the three chuckled in jest. I expect your new promotions to astound everyone, Cedric remarked before departing with a surprise for Autumn. The results of their research aligned with the trio's thoughts. Everyone leaned towards vibrant, grand fireworks. George and Fred resolved to create an unprecedentedly massive firework display. Within the Request Anything room, the two researchers entered rest mode, and Blair shared his idea. We can set the date for after the nude exams. Blair leaned against the shoulders of his companions, George and Fred, who extended their hands and made a thumbs-up gesture in front of him. Good idea, Lyle, they exclaimed in unison. In that case, we can consider this fireworks display as our farewell to Hogwarts, George remarked. Oh, Merlin, it's hard to fathom that we are about to bid adieu to Hogwarts. Fred added immediately. Farewell to Hogwarts, and hello to Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, Blair echoed Fred's sentiment. Upon reflection, it didn't seem so difficult to accept. After a brief pause, George commented, In fact, I'm starting to look forward to it. Having made their decision, the trio returned to their studies and research, albeit with a renewed sense of enthusiasm. The mere thought of what they were embarking upon was already exhilarating. When do you plan to promote it, and how? Cedric inquired as he happened upon the trio. Just wait and see. The effect will undoubtedly be spectacular. George and Fred chimed in harmoniously. Blair then shared an exclusive tidbit with Cedric. Tom will reveal the details once the nude exams conclude. As for the method, You'll find out then. During the NEWT examinations, Hogwarts students were either engrossed in their end-of-term assessments or participating in the OWL exams, or similarly undertaking the NEWT tests. The collective nerves were frayed, and when vibrant fireworks erupted in the sky, many failed to register the occurrence. Am I hallucinating? What is that in the sky? Oh, Merlin. Have I lost my mind due to these exams? What on earth is happening? Such exclamations filled the air. The increasingly grand display of fireworks confirmed that they were not merely seeing things, nor were they losing their sanity. The instigators summoned their flying broomsticks, ascending into the air as the fireworks reached their zenith. Our shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Opening soon. Located at 93 Diagon Alley. George and Fred proclaimed, each taking turns to shout. Blair added, welcome, everyone. Grand opening discounts await. In an instant, the attention of all Hogwarts students was captivated by the trio in the sky. The influx of customers during the summer proved that their promotional efforts were not in vain. Chapter 110, The Conclusion. Throughout the summer, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes became the most bustling shop in Diagon Alley. How much for this? I want this, and this all wrapped up. Wow. I'll take 2 of those portable swamps. The sounds of inquiries and orders were relentless, and communication within the shop largely relied on shouting. 2 galleons. Blair quickly glanced around and announced before resuming his work. The scene was much the same for George and Fred. The 3 of them desperately wished they could learn to duplicate themselves at that moment. Ron, who had been summoned to help during the holidays, had no opportunity to seek out Hermione and Harry upon seeing them enter the shop. This is utterly insane, Hermione exclaimed, gazing at the throngs crowding the store. After struggling to push his way in, Harry remarked, I think we should suggest they widen the shop's entrance. Good idea, Hermione agreed as she and Harry approached Ron. Feeling a pat on his shoulder, Ron turned to see Hermione and Harry and quickly retracted his initial inquiry. What do you want? Oh, it's you too. This business is thriving, Harry commented to Ron. It's so busy that I haven't had a break since this morning. Ron replied, if you take a break, your new books and robes for the next term won't materialize. George and Fred chimed in, having approached Ron's side. Ron continued with his tasks, while Harry and Hermione indicated they would return to see him once he finished. Oh, then we might not meet again, Ron exaggeratedly responded. After his shift, Ron left the exhausting environment. Once Blair, George, and Fred closed the shop door, they retreated to the room they had reserved within the store. Blair collapsed flat onto the bed, while George and Fred each rested on his arm. The room was adorned with a cozy ambience, with fresh flowers gracing the table. On the wall opposite the bed hung a board displaying photos of the trio. A love letter that had originally been placed on the sofa in Blair's room was also transferred to this wall. As the new school year commenced, the number of patrons in the shop dwindled. However, owls flocking to the shop had caused the glass doors to shatter on 2 occasions. Over the course of 2 years, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes became a household name within the British wizarding community. At this juncture, Blair received a letter from Dumbledore. What did Dumbledore say? Fred inquired curiously. Blair merely smiled in response. George wiped away a tear from the corner of his eye and then asked, what is so amusing? Dumbledore recommended me for a position at the Ministry of Magic. Before Blair could finish, George and Fred exclaimed in unison, what? And it's a department that used to give us quite the headache, Blair said mysteriously. Observing the puzzled expressions on their faces, he revealed, the Wizarding Examinations Authority. Upon hearing Blair's answer, George and Fred fell into a contemplative silence. The letter from Dumbledore also mentioned the resolution regarding Harry's scar. The dream of Voldemort's resurrection had quietly dissipated. The Wizarding Examinations Authority, responsible for the NEWT and OWL examinations, was where Blair's future lay. George and Fred's expressions became increasingly peculiar, and Blair noted that they resembled individuals suffering from stomach ailments. When Ron discovered Blair was the invigilator during the NEWT exams, his reaction was even more exaggerated than that of George and Fred. How could it be you overseeing the exams? He asked Blair after the exams concluded. Blair replied, I'll be monitoring for the next few days. It seems we've crossed paths more frequently lately than I have with George and Fred. Oh, they might be jealous of me, Ron mused in line with Blair's comments. Ron's accurate guess left Blair momentarily speechless. When George and Fred protested that it was unfair, Blair's retort silenced them. Would you two care to retake the exams? The other side of the two-way mirror fell into an immediate hush. Every July, amidst the busyness, Blair contemplated resigning, yet during the quieter months, he was immensely grateful to Dumbledore. As the busy season approached in July, George and Fred began to feel anxious as early as May. Curse this exam month. It tormented us during our schooling and continues to haunt us even after graduation. The 2 individuals resolved to create cherished memories during the examination month, and during Blair's second proctoring, they began to devise their plan. With a year of preparation ahead, they aspired to propose to Blair in the following year's examination month. The busy Blair sensed some of their intentions, though not with complete clarity. Once he found a moment of leisure, Blair became aware of their true motives, prompting him to take action as well. As George and Fred awaited the conclusion of Blair's proctoring to present their proposal, they discovered that Blair was not assigned this task this year. Perhaps Blair had discerned their thoughts. With this notion in mind, George and Fred expedited their plans. The unfamiliar rings in their possession, alongside the peculiar earrings adorning Blair's ears, signified the outcome of the proposal. The old ring had been repurposed by Blair into a necklace, which now hung around their necks. The Vance couple attended the proposal, and the Weasley family, including even the farthest traveling Charlie, was present. Upon learning of the news, Dumbledore wrote to Blair, expressing his desire to reserve a spot as the officiant. The aesthetic of the wedding ceremony shattered the preconceived notions that everyone held about George and Fred, presenting a remarkably beautiful and solemn atmosphere that made it hard for the attendees to associate it with them. Holding the hands of both men, Blair could feel their trembling. The quivering hands and serious expressions vividly illustrated their anxiety. Following the ceremony, George and Fred remained ensnared in their nervous state. "Surely, you two do not intend to maintain such expressions before me all night?" Blair inquired as they returned to their room at the shop. "Of course not," Fred and George replied, approaching Blair. Instinctively, Blair retreated a few steps, finding himself seated upon the bed. This scene made him feel as though, once he fell onto the bed, he might never rise again. Yet, it proved that merely touching the edge of the bed could ensnare him in its embrace, leaving him unable to get up. The end of the text. If you enjoyed this, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for your support.